Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on analysis of the 2019 exam diet. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney for 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Sir, education is the highest priority of this government because we want all of Scotland's children and young people to reach their full potential. We believe we have a moral imperative to ensure that all young people in Scotland receive a first-class education in their local school. Monitoring and analysing performance is key to ensuring that we deliver this overriding aim. That is why this government and its partners regularly consider young people's performance in exams and take action to support continued strong performance. I previously committed in this chamber that I would publish analysis of the 2019 exam diet, and that is what I did last Thursday. 4 papers produced by the Association of Directors of Education of Scotland, Education Scotland, the Scottish Qualifications Authority and the Scottish Government, considering diet performance, were published, including summary information and proposed system-wide actions for partners. A substantial proportion of this information was also contained within a response to an FOI review that I was advised required to be answered last Thursday in order to meet the statutory deadline. Because the bulk of the material formed part of the review response, I took the decision to release both the report and the review concurrently. I was conscious of my commitment to Parliament to publish this material and therefore did not feel it would have been appropriate to release it to a private individual alone without also making it available to Parliament through general publication. I must be clear with Parliament, however, that it was never our intention to release this as late in the day as ultimately took place. The necessary material for issue was approved at approximately 5:30 p.m. This is later than would have been ideal, but given the deadline I had been advised of, I proceeded with publication. I have subsequently been advised that the statutory deadline was incorrect. It is therefore deeply unfortunate that a series of issues delayed publication, including the issuing of a press release, until later that same evening. I can assure Parliament, however, that we sought to be as timely and as informative as possible with this publication, but it must not be forgotten that much of this material is not new. Indeed, much of it has been available since August last year, as the SQA publish a commentary on exam results and individual course reports annually. Members will also be keenly aware of the number of times that we have discussed this information both in this chamber and at committee. I am not suggesting that such an important issue does not merit discussion, far from it. I welcome any discussion on this government's education record and the significant improvements delivered. However, what I hope we can all agree on is the need to focus discussion on positive steps that can be taken to support our young people in achieving their potential. It is important to note that the papers demonstrate an excellent collaboration with our partners in considering the drivers of exam performance, which has identified a range of actions to underpin future positive performance in exams. I previously set out to the Education and Skills Committee on the 27th of November 2019 that the key areas to focus on when following up this analysis included partners conducting further work to ensure there is alignment of the curriculum and assessment journey from S1 to S6, partners considering how to better support professional learning and development, and maintaining a clear focus on enhancing learning and teaching. The papers released last week included further details as to how this could be achieved. Actions set out included the following: that partners will remind teachers and schools of the various materials and activities available to support professional learning, particularly for any subjects where course reports have identified specific issues. That the SQA will evaluate its approach to assessment and the ongoing appropriateness of that approach. The identification of key priorities for support for learning, teaching and assessment. The Education Scotland Senior Regional Advisors would discuss national qualifications result with local authority directors to identify which schools need further support or challenge and how best to meet any need in a collaborative and empowered system. Agreeing how to identify schools that need the most support to raise attainment and how to identify follow-up action. The Education Scotland and the Association of Directors of Education agreeing how to share performance across regional improvement collaboratives and to include follow-up action within the plans of those collaboratives. And longer-term work to ensure the alignment of the curriculum and the assessment journey from S1 to S6. All partners considering coordinated enhancement to support professional learning and development, and all partners providing evidence to feed into the ongoing discussions on performance. There will be a focus on delivering these actions to support future performance, and I would also highlight actions underway, such as expanding teacher numbers to a 10-year high and increasing the focus on enhancing learning and teaching, strengthening leadership, reducing workload and promoting teacher empowerment, empowering schools with the resources and the flexibility they need to close the attainment gap and meet the distinctive needs of pupils through pupil equity funding, increasing the capacity of local authorities and schools facing the greatest challenges through the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and strengthen the capacity to support improvement in our education system by creating regional improvement collaboratives and expanding the work of Education Scotland, including the appointment of 6 senior regional advisors and 32 attainment advisors, 1 for each authority. An additional action identified was to continue to raise the profile of the mixed economy of awards and pathways, including to consider a second National Achievement Day, celebrating the impact of a wider range of pathways. We should never forget that one of the key aims of Curriculum for Excellence is to support all children and young people to achieve their potential and to do so in whichever form that may take. Statistics released just this week show that the number of young people achieving 1 or more awards monitored as part of developing the young workforce reached 17.1% last year, up from 14.8% the year before. It is entirely appropriate to consider the drivers of exam performance and to better understand how we may best support future performance, but this should be done in parallel with recognising the significant achievements to celebrate in Scottish education. We have more young people leaving for positive destinations than ever before, and there have been significant improvements for school leavers in achieving 1 or more national qualifications at levels 4 to 7 over time. Specifically, performance at level 6 at Highers has improved, When the government took office, significantly less than half of pupils, 41.6% to be precise, left school with a higher or equivalent or better. Direct comparison cannot always be made due to changes in the precise way that statistics are collected. But what I can say is that the latest figure is over 60%, at 60.5% of pupils at least at that level. Where we can make direct comparisons, we find those getting a higher or better is up more than 10 percentage points on 2009-10, from 50.4% to 60.5% in 2018-19. The attainment gap is closing here too. For those achieving higher level awards or better, the gap between the most and the least well off has fallen by a fifth since 2009-10. It is not the case that some subjects matter more than others. However, when we look at the subjects taken by the most pupils, the majority of the top 10 have seen pass rates increase since 2015. Maths, chemistry, modern studies, physics, biology and geography, major subjects, are all up. And we should acknowledge volatility in pass rates. Last year saw an increase in the pass rate at National 5 and a fall in the pass rate at Higher on the previous year. We cannot expect a continual increase in pass rates. The published papers set out pass rates by exam and did so with a clear warning that where subjects have small numbers of entries, changes in pass rates should be considered with caution. This is important from advice from the SQA that should assist constructive and dispassionate consideration of the content of the papers. What is clear is that there are plenty of achievements by our children and young people to celebrate and to build upon. We can at the same time celebrate current successes and also recognise that time may yet still be needed to fully achieve what we've been working towards. I remain committed to the changes we have instituted and continue to believe that they are the right things to do. In so doing, I'm also committed to working with our partners to continue to monitor performance, to learn and to drive further improvement. The Government has engaged constructively with Parliament on a further element of this process through a review of the curriculum, and I was pleased to set out yesterday the terms of the review. Presiding Officer, it is right to consider exam performance, and it is right to share the messages from that. That is what I said I would do, and that is what I did. There is plenty to celebrate in the achievements of our young people, and we will continue with our efforts to ensure there can be many more in the future. The published papers set out what future actions are needed, and these will be taken forward to ensure that each young person in Scotland will be able to achieve their full potential.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I'll allow around 20 minutes for that, and it would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of the statement? Having only taken up the education brief a week ago, it is clear that there is much good work going on in Scottish education. There are many people who are passionately working to deliver the best education they can. But from the volume of correspondence in my inbox, Presiding Officer, and what we've learned this past week, we now know, actually, that the number of people leaving school with at least one qualification has dropped. The number of people leaving school with the gold standard of 3 hires or more is at the lowest since 2014. There was a significant drop in pass rates at the higher level in key subjects such as English, Maths and History, some subjects dropping by as much as 10%, far beyond acceptable annual variation. We know that the remit for the review into the Curriculum for Excellence has now been expanded after political pressure from these benches and others, all the while the Cabinet Secretary protesting that everything was fine. And yesterday we learned in a well-respected piece of research by the University of Dundee that Scotland has lost its coveted place at the top of the UK's nations for children's reading. So, Presiding Officer, the jargon and excuse-filled statement we've just had from Mr Swinney simply won't wash. Let me ask him specifically. Does he disagree with teachers who believe that a 10% drop is way more than the anticipated or acceptable levels of annual volatility in exam rates? Does he accept that the fact that attainment across many levels has been in decline for the past 5 years, which seems to suggest that reforms to the curriculum or examination structures have not been as effective as they were intended? And does he not accept that the closure of the attainment gap is actually a result of a higher decline in attainment amongst the least deprived, rather than a levelling up from those in the most deprived? I know we all want to get this right, But until the Education Secretary has the humility to accept that when something is not working, it needs to be fixed, we won't get this right. And that will be a shame which rests on his head and his party's for a long time to come.
John Swinney.
President Officer, I think I know Mr Green's just recently assumed office, but if he looks at what I've said and what I said yesterday in the speech that I gave at the Wester Hales Education Centre, I made it expressly clear that I do not believe everything is perfect. I believe there are constantly issues that we need to improve in Scottish education, and I face up to those issues. I do take some reassurance from the assessment of the International Council of Education Advisors who met in Scotland last week. And their judgment, which I quoted yesterday, was that the Scottish education system is taking all of the approaches and the interventions that they would expect to see in a high-performing education system. Now, that is not to say that everything is perfect. It is to recognise that we are taking a set of interventions that are designed to strengthen performance. Now, Mr Green made reference to the reading survey that was issued today, but of course the Conservatives make a lot out of the PISA figures on a regular basis, and of course the PISA analysis, which came out relatively recently, just before the turn of the year, indicated a significant increase in performance in reading in Scotland, to the point where there are only 5 countries in the world that have a discernibly stronger performance in reading than Scotland on the survey that the Conservatives themselves believe to be the strongest assessment of performance. Now, on his point about volatility in exams, there will be exam volatility. If Mr Green is going to argue that exam pass rates must constantly increase, then he will be at odds with all prevailing educational opinion that recognises we cannot have constantly rising pass rates. So there will be volatility in individual subjects, but I also made the point in my statement that in the large volume qualifications, the majority of those at higher saw an increase in the pass rates. The second point is that Mr Green said there had been a 5-year fall in attainment. Well, I have the figures for the percentage of school leavers attaining 1 or more pass at SCQ level 4, 5 or 6 in front of me. And over the last, I accept in the last year, in 2018-19, there are slight falls in those figures. But in all of the previous, let's go back 5 years, back to 13-14 on the higher, and it was 58.1%, and it's now 60.5%. Now that's an increase. If we go back even further, in 2009-10 at SCQF level 6, the percentage of young people achieving 1 or more pass rate at SCQF level 6 was 50.4%. It's now 60.5%. That's a huge increase in performance. And lastly, I'm absolutely committed to working to close the poverty-related attainment gap, and I'm determined to take all of the necessary interventions that I can to ensure that's the case. There is clear evidence across a majority of indicators that we are closing that attainment gap. Yes, it will take time, but the Government's resolve is absolute to secure that objective.
Colleen Gray.
Thank you, and thanks to the Deputy First Minister for early sight of his statement, if not early sight of the report itself. I remember some convoluted excuse notes from my teaching days, but today's opening explanation was indeed a classic of the genre. However, we have the analysis now, and I have 3 questions. Firstly, can we just agree that the key finding is a 4-year trend of falling attainment in the majority of subjects at all levels, except for a slight 1-year improvement in National 5? Secondly, will the OECD review not just have this analysis available to them, but will they be expected to consider whether these trends are indeed driven by the curricular structure? And finally, I've been struck by the response from a number of teachers that they see the problem as the loss in most schools of specialist subject principal teachers and in all authorities of specialist subject advisors. Will Mr Swinney take positive steps to reverse this unplanned change to how our schools are structured?
John Swinney.
On the first point that Mr Gray raises, we have to look at performance over a number of years. And when we look at that performance, as I've just rehearsed with Mr Green, we see a strong rise in the attainment of young people of the percentage of school leavers attaining one or more pass at SCQF level 4, 5 or 6 over the duration of this government. Now, when he talks about the hires, and I've heard his point about the pass rate at higher, Mr Gray knows full well there is no statistical difference for 3 years in the pass rate performance. He knows that. Mr Gray is a man who knows his numbers. He's experienced in that as a teacher, a former teacher. He knows there is no statistical significant difference in 3 years of those numbers, with the exception, which I have always accepted, of the fall in the pass rate between 2017-18 and 2018-19. But Mr Gray must also accept from me that the reverse took place in the National 5 pass rate, where it fell in 2017-18 and it went up in 2018-19. So that analysis must be seen over the period of time. On the second point about the OECD will be free to look at whatever the OECD considers appropriate to look at. And they can consider all aspects of these questions as they undertake the review. It will be independent of government, and it's not for me to prejudge how the OECD goes about that exercise. Thirdly, Mr Gray, I think, knows from what I've said before that I think the loss of subject specialisms in schools has been a matter of regret. It's taken place over a number of years, which is why, under the Career Pathways Development work that I commissioned from Professor Moira Bolland of the University of Glasgow, I have supported the development of career specialisms within the teaching profession to ensure that some of that capacity can be restored. So that's the first thing I've done. And the second thing is that by the investments that I've made in Education Scotland over the last 2 years, we have strengthened the subject capability within Education Scotland, and we have also strengthened the regional capability of Education Scotland to be able to support improvement in our schools. And those are reforms that I think will benefit schools in Scotland.
Can I say here that the guidelines are that front bench questions would take 5 minutes, and here we are almost halfway through the session. There are backbenchers who will not be able to ask questions today. And I call Ross Greer to be followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you. On Tuesday, I asked the Cabinet Secretary about shortfalls in the pass rate for specific subjects such as higher history and the need to investigate those declines. There is a clear trend across most higher subjects, though, indicating a systematic issue as well as specific course problems. Teachers have repeatedly identified the problem with excessive performance indicators and how they create a perverse incentive towards a burdensome tick-box culture of teaching. So can I ask, will the Scottish Government take action to address the number and the role of performance indicators?
John Swinney.
I'd be very pleased to explore the specifics of the issue that Mr Greer raises with me. As he knows, I have taken steps to remove many performance indicators. I removed unit assessments, which were burdensome, I accept, and I've removed them over a 3-year period at my request. We have removed all manner of pointless bureaucracy about management, for example, in the broad general education of experiences and outcomes and whether they are satisfied in all circumstances. So if Mr Greer wants to write to me with some specific points about indicators, I'll happily consider that, because I have no interest in the collection of pointless information if it distracts teachers from enhancing learning and teaching.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Clare Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also add my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of the statement. The Cabinet Secretary said yesterday that pupil equity funding has been provided on a sustained basis, but our analysis of government figures has found that the total PEF allowance for 2019-20 is lower than what was actually spent last year in 23 local authority areas. And that means support might actually be scaled back in some areas this year. So will the Cabinet Secretary commit to making PEF a permanent feature of Scottish education with multi-year settlements so that investment decisions can be made for children for the long term and providing greater certainty to schools and staff?
John Swinney.
Let me reassure Beatrice Wishart that we allocate £120 million of pupil equity funding for each year. If it is not spent in that year, the allocations are protected and preserved to enable them to be spent in subsequent years, by the individual schools concerned. So there is, if a school does not spend all of its PEF allocation in 1 year, it does not lose that allocation, it is carried forward. So if there is an example where that's not happened, I would be happy to explore it, but it shouldn't have happened. The government has had a manifesto commitment to sustain pupil equity funding up until March 2021. I confirmed some months ago that we would extend that to March 2022 because we will formulate a budget in the spring of next year which will cover the financial year to the end of 2022. So for as long as the line of sight I have as in this parliamentary term, PEF will be a permanent feature of education spending. And if there is any carryover from 1 year to the next, I assure Beatrice Wishart that that should be available to individual schools. But if she has any examples where it's not the case, I would encourage her to write to me and I'll follow that up.
Clare Adamson, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Recent figures have shown that in my area of North Lanarkshire, 94.3% of school leavers in 2018-19 went on to positive destinations after school. This compared with 86.9 in 2009-10. Can the Deputy First Minister outline how the Scottish Government will build on the excellent work already being undertaken throughout the learner journey to prepare pupils for destinations after school?
John Swinney.
There will be there's some very good work going on in schools across the country, and it will be the case also, and it is the case in North Lanarkshire as well. I saw it when Clare Adamson and I visited Braidhurst High School in her own constituency, where there is strong work being undertaken through the Developing Scotland's Young Workforce Agenda, which connects school pupils increasingly with the world of work. It's enhanced also by the availability of foundation apprenticeships, which are a strong new element of the learner journey to enable young people to progress in that fashion. There will be some groups where we face more significant challenges in relation to positive destinations, and they will undoubtedly be amongst young people with additional support needs and young people who are care experienced. And as Clare Adamson will be familiar, the Government is taking a range of measures, particularly in the light of the Care Review report, to make sure that we work to strengthen the outcomes for young people who are care experienced to ensure they can enjoy the same positive destinations as the overwhelming majority of Clare Adamson's constituents will be experiencing.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Daniel Johnson.
In their analysis document last week, the Scottish Government said pass rates are only part of the attainment story, which seems a casual lack of concern when faced with another year when attainment has fallen across a range of outcomes. What the Scottish Government seems to be ignoring at these pass rates represent individuals who risk being left with the consequences of this decline in standards for the rest of their lives. So, can I ask the Deputy First Minister, if he does indeed, and I quote, welcome any discussion on this Government's education record, why has his Government failed to bring forward a full debate on education in this chamber for 2 years? And will he give a commitment today to ensure that more government time is given over this year to debate what was once their #1 priority?
John Swinney.
Subject to the agreement of the Parliamentary Bureau, there will be a government debate on education on the 17th of March.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In his answer to Clare Adamson, the Cabinet Secretary mentions the need to focus on ASN, but recently released figures from the SC highlight that since 2012, spend per pupil for those with ASN has fallen by 26%, and the number of specialist ASN support staff has decreased by 403. So how does the Cabinet Secretary explain this worrying trend? What will he do to fix it? And does he agree with me that we simply cannot address the ASN attainment gap without those specialist staff?
As Mr Johnson will be aware, Presiding Officer, the Government has invested £15 million of additional expenditure into supporting additional support needs education. That will, of course, be subject to decision this afternoon when, of course, the Government's budget has to pass to enable that expenditure to be undertaken, which I'm sure will be a point that Mr Johnson is reflecting on as he goes forward. And I think I properly heard Ms Mara's aside, and I'll just say to her that I'm very pleased that local authority investment in education has been rising for 3 years in a row, and that's a welcome investment in the education of our young people in challenging times. So I assure Mr Johnson of the absolute determination of the Government to invest properly. I am awaiting, as he knows, the outcome of the review undertaken by Angela Morgan into additional support needs education, and I look forward to engaging with the review on the issues that have been raised to address directly the point that Mr Johnson raises.
Rona Mackay, followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's outline of the reviewed remit and thank him for his communication with the Education and Skills Committee during this process. How will the review seek to engage directly with teachers and hear the views of education practitioners across the board?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I intend to establish, as part of the review, a practitioner forum which will enable the voice of practitioners to be heard within the review, and also for the voice of young people to be heard within that review, because it is so important that the lived experience of those who are teaching and experiencing education in Scotland is heard by the OECD in this review.
Liz Smith.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I was very encouraged to hear that you are, within the remit, going to be looking at the responsibilities for curriculum design and support. Could I just clarify why that means that the OECD will be examining the role that Education Scotland and SQA has in that respect?
John Swinney.
First of all, Presiding Officer, this is the first opportunity I've had to acknowledge the reshuffle in the Conservative benches at Liz Smith's, or the impact on Liz Smith, and thank her for her long interest in education. I had hoped for a moment that that long interest had stopped, but she's just asked another question on education, so I presume it must be. We're going to be stuck with it for some time to come, which of course will be a privilege and a pleasure for me to experience it. In relation to the roles in curriculum design, the OECD will be open, as I answered to Mr Gray, to look at the issues that they believe to be relevant. I'm not going to prescribe to the OECD what they think should be explored, but the topics and the themes are there for the OECD to consider as part of that review.
Quickly, Jenny Mara.
The number of children leaving school in Dundee without any qualifications has risen again, 0.8% in 2011 to 4.8% today. These children leaving school have had every day, week, month and year of their education under the SNP. They've been utterly failed by nationalism. Now, Dundee has yet to set its budget. Will Mr Swinney pick up the phone to John Alexander today and tell him not to make cuts to education in Dundee?
Quickly, please, Mr Swinney.
Well, as I accurately predicted where Ms Mara might be heading in her questions with her muttering earlier on, let me just say to Jenny Mara that I'm very pleased that Scottish local authorities have increased expenditure on education for the last 3 years, and I look forward to local authorities continuing that trend.
That concludes questions in the statement. Unfortunately, Alistair Allen, Gail Ross and Stuart McMillan weren't able to get in. Can I say to everyone, please, that when, as presiding officers, we cut off people mid-statement and ask for questions, there are complaints. The other side of that is that people ramble on, rather, both in questions and answers, and other colleagues get missed out. So please have a think to how we deal with these things in the future. We will move on to the next item of business.
Good. Now, they'll be ready for me now then. Thank you. The next item of business is portfolio questions on health and sport. Question 1, Neil Findlay, please.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on when Dr Veronikis will come to Scotland to carry out full mesh removal procedures.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
This week, the Chief Medical Officer wrote to Dr Veronikis to reiterate her invitation for him to come to Scotland for an observational visit. In their discussions up to now, they have been looking at a provisional date of April or May. She was also able to advise him of the offer of a contract of employment, subject to the detailed deliberations and agreement on processes and working within the NHS Scotland environment that had previously been discussed with him and are standard for any visiting clinician.
We hope Dr Veronikis will be able, clearly subject to his availability, to accept this offer. And today the Chief Medical Officer has again written to Dr Veronikis to get his response to the letter that she'd sent earlier with that offer of a contract of employment.
Neil Findlay, please.
Things are moving ahead very, very slowly, Cabinet Secretary, but I'm pleased to hear that there is some progress at last. But in the meantime, women here are being told that they are having full mesh removal procedures. These are being recorded on their medical records, only for them then to go and be operated on by Dr Veronikis in the US and find that 10, 15, 20 or more centimetres of mesh is being removed from them. This week, I got a response from the First Minister following the meeting we had in November that said that women had to, if they had these concerns, should report these cases to the regulators if they had concerns. These women have gone through enough. They don't need added stress of taking individual cases to the GMC. So I'm asking whether you, the Cabinet Secretary, or indeed the First Minister, will now call in the General Medical Council to look at what appears to be the systematic misleading of patients recorded on patients' notes here in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
So 2 points. First of all, just on the point about matters moving slowly, I completely understand what Mr Findlay is saying there and share that frustration, but there are proper processes to go through in terms of making sure, as Dr Veronikis has acknowledged, that he understands the environment in Scotland in which he would be operating in, and he has accepted, indeed, that it is the right professional approach to come for that observational visit, so we understand too what he needs by way of instruments and so on before he can come and operate. The contract of employment is a clear indication that that is what we want, where we want to be. On your point about cases, you have raised this before, and what we committed to doing was an independent clinician-led case note review. That is underway. Professor Alison Britton has agreed to act as moderator for the review. It will involve the women individually with those independent clinicians who are sourced by the Royal College of Gynaecologists, looking at each of their individual cases and discussing that through with them. That is the right next step before we see what evidence exists that could, if it's necessary, be referred to regulators. But we need to do that, and we need to do that in a way that involves, as it has done, the Royal College, Professor Britton and the Health and Social Care Alliance in terms of ensuring that there are patient views fed into this, and that work is well underway. The actual specific reviews will begin in April, and the individual women, all the women whose information we hold from the meetings that the First Minister and I had with them, plus any others who have written to me and any others who then want to come forward. But on the ones that we have at the moment, they will all be written to and told exactly what will happen about their individual cases, how to be involved in that, and that we will take the lead in ensuring that those individual cases are looked at. If there is further action as a consequence of that, because it's a very serious situation, then Mr Findlay should be assured that I will take that further action.
Thank you. Quite rightly, that was a very long and detailed answer, but I must ask for shorter supplementaries here and shorter answers, because that was a very full answer. Miles Briggs, followed by Ruth
Thank
Maguire.
you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the letter to me of the 24th of February, the Cabinet Secretary says that there's currently work ongoing drawing up the organisation's set-up criteria and validity for the new £1 million fund being made available. Can I ask, will women affected be involved in this, and what discussions have taken place to date?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
The answer to that is yes. We are again working with the Health and Social Care Alliance. We have a lot of information already from the women who've been in touch, that we've met and so on, about the specific financial issues that have affected them. But we will continue to involve them, and I hope very shortly to announce the exact details of that fund, what the criteria are, how to apply, and so on.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My constituent Julie is a full-time carer for her husband and has serious mobility issues. She's anxious and worried about her capacity to make the journey through to Edinburgh and the impact on that on her recovery. Would the Cabinet Secretary explore the issue of travel, recovery and rehabilitation for women from the west of Scotland travelling to Edinburgh with me, perhaps at a later date.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
I'm very happy to look in more detail. First of all, to give Ms Maguire the existing arrangements and how they may assist, but also to look in more detail both at the use of the fund, but also whether or not there are aspects of that care that can be delivered more locally.
Question 2, Clare Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve outcomes for people with inflammatory bowel disease.
Minister Clare Haughey.
The Scottish Government, through its Modernising Patient Pathways programme, has been working closely with health boards and Crohn's and Colitis UK in recent years to improve IBD services, pathways and patient outcomes across Scotland. This includes the development of a series of self-management tools, care plans, mobile app and supporting the pilot of new specialist IBD community nurse models. In addition, we are currently trialling flare cards in NHS Lothian. These provide people with quick and easy advice on immediate steps that they can take to help manage unpredictable and fluctuating symptoms and have been co-developed with Crohn's and Colitis UK. They will shortly be extended to a further 2 health board areas, NHS Grampian and Borders, with the intention to roll out the use of flare cards across the rest of Scotland, subject to further evaluation.
Clare Adams.
Can I thank the Minister for her reply and for the information regarding the flare cards. In discussion with the cross-party group on IBD, it's my understanding that different health boards have different pathways for diagnosis and treatment of people, some using primary care, some using secondary care options. In this context, can I ask the Minister what the Government is doing to ensure that there are clear pathways and protocols available for IBD sufferers across Scotland and that those pathways are in line with best practice?
Clare Adams. Answering your own question. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I pay tribute to the work of the IBD cross-party group and also to the interest that Clare Adamson has shown over some years in this area. The Modernising Patient Pathways programme is leading on a series of national workshops with the gastroenterology community across Scotland with a view to producing evidence-based standardised pathways for people who present with lower GI symptoms, including those with an IBD diagnosis.
Mary Fee.
Children and young people with inflammatory bowel disease are often misdiagnosed, resulting in multiple hospital admissions and absences from school. And early diagnosis is a significant factor given the huge rise in paediatric inflammatory bowel disease, mainly driven by Crohn's disease. What steps will the Scottish Government and the NHS take to improve diagnosis for children and young people with inflammatory bowel disease?
Minister.
I thank Mary Fee for that answer. I think it's a really important issue that she's raised. The Scottish Government has been investing in research by Cure Crohn's and Colitis in Childhood Research Project that's led by Professor Charlie Lees, who's a consultant gastroenterologist based at the Western General Hospital. The project will help to determine what causes disease flare-ups in some patients and has the potential to lead to the development of personalised therapy in colitis. And that project that I refer to there is the PREDICT study. So there is investment going on across Scotland and research, and I think it's a really important issue.
Question 3, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what investment is making in the Scottish Ambulance Service ahead of the West of Scotland Trauma Network being launched.
Cabinet Secretary.
By the end of 2019-20, we will have invested £33.4 million in the Scottish Trauma Network, which includes the Scottish Ambulance Service, with funding planned to increase to 41.6 annually by 2023-24. From this investment to date, the SAS Trauma Desk, based at the Glasgow Ambulance Control Centre, is operational 24/7, playing a vital role in the coordination of services in response to trauma, with additional investment in major trauma equipment across the service's emergency vehicle fleet.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. And at a recent Community Council meeting in my constituency, where senior staff from Inverclyde Royal Hospital spoke about the West of Scotland Trauma Network, there were concerns raised by constituents about the impact on local ambulance provision. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide assurances to my constituents that the Scottish Ambulance Service will be able to meet the needs of the local community when the trauma network is launched, and it will not result in slow response times in Inverclyde, particularly when ambulances do have to take people up to Paisley and Glasgow?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr McMillan for that supplementary. I do understand that those concerns will arise in this instance. However, the ambulance service is really clear of our expectation that they give consideration to the impact of any changes where additional demands are placed on their capacity. They're currently undertaking a national review of demand and capacity, which will include the anticipated demand on them from the West of Scotland Trauma Network, as they're using their experience from elsewhere in Scotland, where we have the trauma centres now in Aberdeen and in Dundee. That review of demand and capacity will help them ensure that they are able to meet all the demands, and they will bring from that their requirements of the health service in terms of additional resources and where those resources need to be deployed. So we are committed to supporting them in this work and to considering very seriously the outcome of their national review of demand and capacity, taking account of all the factors we've outlined.
Question 4, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what the average waiting times are for a urology appointment at NHS Tayside.
Cabinet Secretary.
So the average wait for a new outpatient urology appointment for Tayside was 32 days during the quarter that ended December 2019. More than £9.6 million has been made available to NHS Tayside in the current financial year to reduce waiting times across all specialties. In autumn of last year, NHS Tayside opened a treatment centre specifically focused on reducing urology waiting times. Their focus is to enhance patient pathways and experience while accessing urology outpatients.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her response? However, given the figures she's quoted, I've been told by two separate constituents just in the last few weeks that they've each been told they have to wait 60 weeks to see a specialist urologist in NHS Tayside. And I'm sure she would agree that for people who have got what are sometimes painful and distressing conditions, that wait of a year and 2 months is totally unacceptable. And can't you do more to help NHS Tayside to address this problem?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I completely agree with Mr Fraser and his constituents that wait is too long. If in the specific cases that he's referencing, he would care to send me those details, then I will pick that up directly with NHS Tayside. There is a trajectory. All the boards have one. They all come from the Waiting Times Improvement Plan, and we have a weekly, indeed in some instances a daily focus with boards on how they are making the improvements against the investment that we have given them to improve their waiting times. So I would want to see exactly what that information is and then have a detailed look with NHS Tayside and get back to Mr Fraser on that matter.
Question 5, Willie Coffey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether obesity rates in school-aged children are reducing and what measures are being considered to make further progress.
Minister.
The percentage of children at risk of being overweight has been fairly constant over the last decade at around 22%, of which 10% are at the risk of obesity. However, there are increasing inequalities in child unhealthy weight between children living in the most and least deprived areas. This is why our ambition to halve childhood obesity by 2030 and significantly reduce health inequalities sits at the heart of our Diet and Healthy Weight Delivery Plan published in 2018. We are taking actions on many fronts. In coming months, we will publish a plan to make it easier for people to eat well out of home, and we will introduce legislation later this year to restrict the promotion of foods high in fat, sugar and salt. There's more to be done to strengthen support for children and families to eat well and to have a healthy weight in early years.
Willie Coffey.
I thank the Minister for that answer. According to Obesity Action Scotland, 16% of children aged 2 to 15, that's about 130,000, are at risk of obesity, and the problems, as the Minister says, seems to be widening between the most deprived and most well-off communities. Can the Minister give us some assurance that the Government's commitment to having child obesity by 2030 can get back on track, and what more can we, our families, our schools do to encourage healthy eating in the home and at school?
Minister.
I can certainly give that commitment to Willie Coffey, that the Scottish Government is committed to reducing the number of obese people in the whole of Scotland, but particularly in childhood. The Scottish Government is doing many things, but fundamentally this is an issue for Scotland, everyone. including public bodies, industry and frontline practitioners, all have a part to play to improve Scotland's diet and support children to eat well. And we welcome the commitment of local partners in North Ayrshire and the East Region and a number of other localities to work across the system to lead innovative action in their local communities. And this includes exploring opportunities through a wide range of levers, such as planning and licensing, to tackle childhood obesity.
Question 6, Ruth Maguire.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the use of punitive sanction regimes in drug and alcohol treatment services.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government does not advocate the use of punitive sanctions in drug and alcohol treatment and recovery services. In common with the rest of our NHS, a person-centred approach to treatment and recovery is a key focus of our Rights, Respect and Recovery strategy, which is highlighted as part of our 8-point treatment plan.
Ruth Maguire.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary will share my concern that punitive sanction regimes do happen in drug and alcohol treatment services. Can I ask what the Scottish Government will do to ensure that this ends and that all treatment services meet people where they are and offers them the best chance for recovery and support?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Ms Maguire for that supplementary. As I think members across this chamber understand, in addition to the significant additional investment that First Minister indicated at FMQs and that my colleague Ms Forbes will make clear in the budget debate to come, all of that investment should be focused in ensuring that all our services, including mental health, as well as other services, in a sense, wrap around the individuals rather than forcing the individuals to fit into the nature of processes and services and how services want to run themselves. That is a clear signal that came to us, a very clear recommendation from the Dundee Commission on drugs, and one that we are actively taking forward in terms of our plans for the coming financial year on how that significant additional investment, in addition to the £50-odd million that sits with our health boards for this work, will be proactively used to ensure that we're listening, as Mr Fitzpatrick is doing yesterday, to the voices of those with real personal experience and to service providers and users to make sure that the drug and alcohol treatment services are targeted at what the individuals need and reach out beyond health into areas of housing and other matters that are the responsibility of our local authority colleagues. So we put the services around the individual and genuinely help them to move on with their lives.
And last question, I'll have to be brief for all counts. Question 7, Anna Sarwar, please.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary.
So, ministers and Scottish Governments regularly meet with representatives from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. As Mr Sarwar will know, we have 2 oversight boards running on that health board. I last met the chair of the health board on the 7th of February. The second performance oversight group, which has been established and is chaired by our Chief Performance Officer for NHS Scotland, met on the 7th of February and their second meeting is later today.
Anna Sarwar,
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. The Cabinet Secretary knows my view on the leadership of the Health Board, but I want to raise the matter of out-of-hours service, which came up at FMQs today. This isn't just about temporary closures, this is now a systemic problem around GP shortages. In 2017, there were 54 closures across the Health Board. In 2018, there was 258 closures across the Health Board. And in 2019, there were 816 closures across the Health Board due to GP shortages. What urgent action will the Cabinet Secretary take to make sure we have a continuity of care for the people across Greater Glasgow and Clyde?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm grateful to Mr Sarwar for that question, and I need to correct you in as much as the problem in out-of-hours services in Greater Glasgow and Clyde is not about GP shortages. GPs are willing to be involved in out-of-hours services. The problem is that Greater Glasgow and Clyde has not paid attention to Sir Lewis Ritchie's review, has not enacted the very clear recommendations that he made in that review, and that has, as a consequence, resulted in those instances that you have referred to. And that is part of the reason, one of the reasons, why I escalated the full board to level 4 in order that we can direct that and improve that service. What is clear to me from visiting those out-of-hours services and from Sir Lewis Ritchie's direct engagement with GPs and my conversations with them is that they are very willing to work in out-of-hours services. For many of them, they see that as a positive enhancement to their role. But what they need is a multidisciplinary team in those services, and they need an appointment-based system, and they need a location which is safe and offers them what they legitimately expect in terms of working conditions. So what the board has done is consolidate to 4 services in order to ensure that they can deliver that under our direction, and then expand from 4 out to 7, out to 9 again, in order to make sure we have a robust, sustainable service. Out-of-hours is critical to our primary care, and that is critical to integration. So I couldn't agree more, but that is the basis of this, and that is why we are taking the action we're taking.
Thank you. I apologise to Fulton McGregor for failing to reach his question. That concludes portfolio questions. We'll have a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business will be the budget. Before we turn to that, however, could I invite colleagues to join me in welcoming to our gallery Mr Alec Maskey, MLA, who is the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Thank you very much. So the next item is a debate on motion 21013 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Budget Scotland Bill at Stage 1. Could I invite all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons? And I call on Kate Forbes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to open this debate today on the budget, and thanks to the Finance and Constitution Committee for their report, to which I will respond ahead of Stage 3. I want to start by thanking all the parties across the Chamber, yes, all of them, for their consideration of the budget and for their constructive engagement in budget discussions. These have been unusual circumstances for all of us. Presiding Officer, it has never been more important for a budget to deliver stability and investment for Scotland's economy and public services, whilst accelerating our response to the climate emergency. The budget I presented to Parliament made significant progress against our 4 key themes of increasing wellbeing, tackling climate change, reducing child poverty and increasing sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Now, I recognise that there is ambition on all sides of the Chamber, including my own, for us to go further in a range of those areas. In order to provide the certainty that our public services require, I met all parties in good faith to secure agreement and ensure the budget passes. I'm therefore delighted to confirm that I have reached an agreement with the Scottish Green Party that will secure the passage of this progressive budget. In addition to the spending measures I outlined to Parliament earlier this month, the agreement that we have struck will deliver an additional £95 million for local authorities, meeting a key ask of all parties and COSLA, an additional £18 million for Police Scotland, helping the men and women of our police force keep us safe, and taking total additional investment to £60 million. £25 million of additional investment in energy efficiency and fuel poverty measures to help tackle climate change, £15 million more in active travel, taking total investment to £100 million for the first time, and £5 million more to support the development of rail infrastructure projects. Perhaps most significantly, though, and which I'm particularly proud to be able to deliver, is our agreement securing an additional £15 million that will support the extension of concessionary bus travel to everybody aged 18 and under. I will take an intervention.
Fraser.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to the Finance Secretary for giving way. I wonder if you could just clarify exactly what is going to happen with concessionary travel for under-19s. Because yesterday the Green Party were trumpeting this new policy initiative that would be delivered, and yet the wording of what is in the agreement from the Finance Secretary it says this money will support preparations for a new scheme with the aim, if possible, to deliver it next year. So is this a cast-iron guarantee, as the Greens are claiming, or is it simply a possibility, as the Finance Secretary is saying?
Well, the member will know that as a competent government, we do not roll out programmes until we ensure that it meets due diligence and is well designed. Presiding officer, there is due diligence and preparatory work to do, not least engaging with the young people themselves to ensure that this system is a system which is designed for them and by them. But I believe that the contribution that this will make to climate change and to helping household budgets and to empowering our young people means that it is very difficult to vote against this at a private vote. All parties were publicly clear about their asks, and there's been agreement across parties in delivering additional local government funding, police funding, action on climate change and on concessionary bus travel. This additional package meets demands from every party in this Parliament. Presiding officer, whilst a deal has been done to secure the passage of the budget bill, I hope all parties will recognise that this is a deal that delivers for the country as a whole. I intend to fund the additional commitments through limited amounts of underspend from this year, taking a multi-year approach to non-domestic rates management without impacting on local authority revenues, and an increased consequentials assumption, including for the fossil fuel levy. These are not without risk, forced as we are to set our budget in advance of the UK Government and with very little clarity on block grant adjustments. But I've made a judgment call, and I recognise that the country needs certainty, they need this budget agreed, and they need this budget passed. The ambition of our National Performance Framework is reflected through the budget's priority themes: tackling climate change, reducing child poverty, supporting inclusive growth, and in the roundest sense, improving the well-being of people in Scotland. Central to this budget are efforts to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy, delivering a Green New Deal for Scotland that works in partnership with people, places and business to deliver the transformation that we need to meet our world-leading climate change targets. The budget sets out new proposals with increased funding in manufacturing, energy use and generation, how we heat our homes and how we use our land, planting new forests and pledging a record investment of £250 million over 10 years to restore our peatlands. All of that will support our efforts to end our contribution to climate change and support Scotland's economy, which in turn will boost well-being. 2020 will also be a landmark year for the devolution of social security benefits, with £3 billion in benefit spend transferring to the Scottish Government. That expenditure will reach approximately 800,000 people, making a real difference to real lives and well-being through a new system that's based on dignity and respect, reinforcing the importance of this budget passing. We are doing all that we can to tackle poverty and inequality in this budget, including £21 million for the new Scottish Child Payment, worth £10 a week per child to low-income families with a child under 6, and described as, and I quote, a game changer by the Child Poverty Action Group. It will be introduced later in 2020. Once fully rolled out, it will lift 30,000 children out of poverty. And alongside that, we are investing £110 million to mitigate the worst impacts of UK government welfare reform, including more for discretionary housing payments and for the Scottish Welfare Fund. The budget also has an outward focus, helping developing countries to grow in a fair and sustainable manner. Another budget milestone is our record investment of £15 billion in health and care services, an increase of more than £1 billion in 2020-21. That not only meets our commitment to pass on all health resource consequentials, it exceeds it by allocating a further £100 million to support frontline spending. The budget I presented to Parliament provided local government with an increase of £494 million to support the delivery of core local services. But having listened to the case made by all parties and COSLA Through our agreement with the Greens, I'll allocate a further £95 million to their core settlement, taking the total increase to £589 million. Returning to the economy, we are focused on stability and growth at this time of uncertain global economic conditions. That's made all the more important by the nature of the hard Brexit being sought by the UK government, so clearly demonstrated in the negotiating mandate published this morning. Alongside early progress on our £7 billion national infrastructure mission, this budget also provides £220 million fresh seed money for the Scottish National Investment Bank, continues to support city, region and growth deals, increases the international trade and investment budget by more than 25% and includes a £200 million commitment to additional low-carbon investment through the innovative Green Growth Accelerator model. And it delivers a 20% increase to the transport infrastructure and connectivity budget. We're also continuing to deliver further support for communities through a progressive public sector pay policy targeted at the lowest paid. We're investing over £800 million to help deliver 50,000 new homes this Parliament, and we're investing in improved bus infrastructure, electric vehicle charging and increased active travel. We're continuing to prioritise investment in education, with real terms increases for further and higher education and £645 million to almost double childcare from August. To help pay for this and other vital expenditure, the budget continues a progressive approach to tax, providing stability ahead of the delayed UK budget. 56% of Scottish income taxpayers will pay less income tax in 2020-21 than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK. 95% of properties in Scotland will pay lower rates poundage than they would elsewhere in the UK. I am proud to present this budget to Parliament. It is a budget that delivers for the people of Scotland and meets the key asks of all parties, despite the uncertainty and the delay of the UK budget. All parties wish to see additional investment in local government. This budget delivers that. All parties wish to see more money for our police. This budget delivers that. All parties wanted to see increased investment to tackle climate change. This budget delivers that. There was one ask of Parliament that I had not yet responded to, and that request was from parties for a £15 million increase in drug services, while our draft budget instead proposed £12.7 million more. I'm pleased to inform Parliament, though I think they might already know, that Jean Freeman has identified an additional £7.3 million from within her portfolio to help reduce the harms and the deaths created and caused by drug use. That will increase direct investment by the Scottish Government in drug services by up to £20 million. That exceeds the demand made upon us. Presiding Officer, this is a budget that renews our social contract with the people of Scotland. It provides the resources that Parliament has requested. There may be parties in this chamber that will contrive reasons to vote against this budget. They may want tax cuts for the rich, or they may want to turn this budget for public services into an argument against independence. But the reality is that this budget delivers their key asks. It delivers for our public services. It delivers for Scotland. And accordingly, I urge all of Parliament to support the budget bill tonight. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to call Donald Cameron to speak to and move Amendment 21013.1.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by paying tribute to my predecessor in this role, Murdo Fraser, who leaves big shoes to fill, and who I am very glad to see is still on the benches beside me and will be speaking later in this debate. I would also, for my part, like to welcome Kate Forbes to her role as Cabinet Secretary for Finance and to note that the takeover of Highland MSPs in respective finance roles proceeds apace. I've enjoyed working with her on many other issues, and I'm sure that our engagement in this portfolio will be constructive. In fact, since I was appointed to this role, we have met on several occasions to discuss the budget, given that our party was open and willing to engage in such dialogue. Those discussions, as she said, were candid and friendly and conducted in good faith. And whilst our parties may hold fundamentally different views on many issues, the one thing we all universally care about in this chamber is that our public services are well funded and that Scotland prospers. So in that spirit, let me start with what we welcome in this budget. We welcome several of the announcements, including additional support for infrastructure and manufacturing. We equally welcome the funding for the police, announced yesterday, though it should not have taken sustained pressure from us and others, including the police themselves, to shame this government into taking action. But let's look at what was not delivered, Presiding Officer, and the reasons why we cannot support this budget. We had an overarching request that there should be no further divergence with UK tax rates, and we asked the Cabinet Secretary to undertake that if the UK government, in its budget on the 11th of March, were to make changes to ease the tax burden on working people south of the border, the Scottish Government would match that. We didn't seek a tax cut. We wanted to ensure that the tax cap widens no further and Scotland can remain competitive and continue to attract the best talent. That commitment was not forthcoming from the Scottish Government, and for that reason alone, we cannot support this budget. But I don't want to focus on tax today, important as it is, because when we met the Cabinet Secretary, we made other reasonable and affordable proposals. We outlined proposals to reverse some of the Scottish Government's damaging cuts to drug rehabilitation services, calling specifically for 15.4 million for drug rehabilitation beds, additional to what was in the budget. And despite our productive conversations with her, that was rejected, and rejected on a day when an editorial in the Times rightly said that Scotland's record of drugs death is a matter of national shame. We sought funding not for combating drugs in general, but a specific policy about providing residential beds. Scotland has seen a dramatic reduction in drug rehab beds. In 2007, there were 352, situated across 22 services. Today, there are just 70 in 3 facilities. This is unacceptable, and it is absolutely unacceptable in this week of all weeks, when we have had 2 drug summits in Glasgow organised by both the UK and Scottish governments, looking at ways to solve this country's worst humanitarian crisis. Presiding Officer, we also outlined to the Cabinet Secretary the problems faced by our cash-strapped councils. And while revenue funding has now been addressed, 95 million, split between 32 local authorities, only goes so far. Taking account of inflation, as Cosler pointed out, is it any wonder that most of these local authorities will have to raise council tax simply to make ends meet? In this context is the government's failure to properly fund the capital allocation to our councils to the figure of 117 million, which we also requested, that I want to concentrate on. And let me illustrate it with an example from the Highlands, close to home for both me and the Cabinet Secretary, in relation to road repairs. Not a glamorous issue, but a crucial one nevertheless. The Highland Council's core capital funding is expected to be 23.74 million, which is a reduction of a third compared to last year. Local councillors tell me it is inevitable that road repairs will be impacted by this cut to capital funding, even with rises in council tax. Yesterday, I saw photos of some of the roads on the north of Skye. Yes, of course.
John Finney.
An intervention. Would the member agree that with a backlog of £3 billion in road repairs, that it is wrong priority for Highland Council to be building new roads as part of the city deal? Obscene sums of money spent on new roads.
Donald Cameron.
I think the member will agree with me that clearly the priority is to fix the roads that are in such bad state. And I was sent photos of some of the roads from the Cabinet Secretary's own constituency in the north of Skye. Roads riddled with potholes, tarmac crumbling, craters everywhere. Whether it's these roads on Skye or the notorious Stromeferry bypass in Wester Ross, deep in the heart of the area that she represents, these are roads, vital lifeline roads, connecting small communities right across Skye, Lochaber and Bainoch.
Cabinet Secretary.
Why then today has Highland Council released a press release that says it's planning to its biggest ever single investment in roads projects for years?
Donald Cameron.
Well, quite simply, as I've said, it is inevitable that they will have to do this with rises in council tax, notwithstanding the cut to their core grant. These are roads, presiding officer, which will not be repaired now. And that's what this budget means in practice for her constituents going about their everyday lives. That's the reality of her budget. And as I've said before, presiding officer, our requests weren't unreasonable or unaffordable. They weren't over the top. For truly extreme demands, well, enter stage left or even stage far left, the Scottish Green Party. Because, of course, this was going to be, no, I've taken many interventions. No, I'm not going to give way. I've taken way many times. This was going to be the Greens. This was going to be the Greens' big year. No more Patrick the Poodle. 2020 was to be the year that the Greens finally stood up to the SNP. The year they stamped their feet. The year they banged their drums. They made their blood-curdling demands. New road projects were to be cut. The dualling of the A9 was to be stopped. The A96 upgrade was to be halted. The Sheriffhall roundabout was to be completely revamped. They were going to get a definitive commitment for free bus travel for young people. And one by one, these demands have either been abandoned or watered down to become meaningless. Let's look at free bus travel. No, I'm not taking intervention. I've taken many already. What have the Greens received? They have received funding to support preparations to introduce concessionary fares, if possible, subject to research and due diligence. There are get-out clauses wherever you look. How much have they received? £15 million. What is the yearly cost to fund this? According to the Greens themselves, £80 million per year. Over 5 times the figure they have actually received. This isn't a commitment from the Scottish Government, it's a contract. Patrick Harvey has been played like a fiddle, and not for the first time. And let me move on to a very serious issue, because underpinning this budget was the assertion that everything in terms of cash was accounted for. Yet again, we were told there was no more money. But it turns out that Kate Forbes has an even bigger sofa than Derek Mackay. Now she knows the respect that I hold her, but it makes a mockery of the budget process to insist there is no more money and then produce it at whim. For committees, I'm in my last minute. For committees involved in budget scrutiny, for external organisations assessing the budget, how can we take this process seriously if the figures we are presented with are simply not real? It is becoming a charade and it demeans this Parliament. Now, of course, thanks to the UK Government, Scotland will benefit from an additional £1.1 billion in real terms, according to the Treasury. But in fact, presiding officer, the Scottish Government figures are even higher. The draft budget refers to a whopping £1.5 billion in Barnett consequentials. There is no austerity. And here's the thing. You cannot complain. You cannot complain about austerity and then inflict austerity on Scotland's local authorities in terms of capital funding. Ultimately, this budget comes at a time that the people of Scotland are having to pay higher council tax bills. It comes at a time when anyone earning over £27,000 will pay more income tax than if they lived in the rest of the UK. As ever, presiding officer, with this government, people are paying more but getting less. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I call Bruce Crawford to open on behalf of the committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before yesterday's agreement between the Scottish Government and the Green Party, I intended to comment that this afternoon's debate would see calls from across the Parliament for additional spending, allocations in the budget. There would be the usual theatre in which the opposition claimed there was money stuffed down the sofa to pay for that additional spending. And in addition, there would be weary sighs from the Government and protestations that the opposition needed to say where the money was coming from. But I'm glad to say, however, whatever is said, that for the sake of stability and certainty in the public sector and the economy, an early agreement has been arrived at. I'll leave it for others to make comment on the merits or otherwise of the budget deal, as I would rightly be accused of straying too far from my remit as the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Whatever the circumstances, the job of the Parliament's committees is not to indulge themselves in the theatre of speculation that surrounds budget deals. No, our job is to get our hands dirty and to ask the difficult questions. The questions that can sometimes be awkward for all the political parties across the Parliament. And the Finance and Constitution Committee's report on this year's budget provides such a difficult and awkward question. The question being whether it remains prudent for both Government and Parliament to agree an annual budget which allocates every available penny. The reason we ask this important question is increased volatility and risk rising from the tax and social security devolution. Certainly.
Findlay. Making a very valid point, but does he not think it is ludicrous that Parliament is told there is no more money, all of the money has been allocated, only for money to be found, magic beans to be found down the back of someone's couch?
I made reference to that in my very opening, so I'm not going to go back over the ground I've already covered. Indeed. The reason we asked this important question is, as I said, the increased volatility and risk arising from tax and social security devolution. At the same time, there are further budgetary risks arising from continued economic uncertainty, likely to be exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19 virus and the UK Government's decisions about EU funding because of Brexit. The operation of the fiscal framework adds to this volatility and risk. The two most significant risks are that spending on demand-led social security benefits in Scotland is higher than the corresponding increase in the block grant, and that devolved tax revenues in Scotland are lower than the adjustment to the block grant. Given the size of these revenues and expenditure can only be estimated when the government is being set, there's an additional risk arising from forecast error. This can result in substantial reconciliations once we know the actual numbers. And we're now starting to see this forecast error impact on income tax. But we only have initial outturn data at this stage, Presiding Officer, so it therefore remains too early to draw firm conclusions on the extent of the risk. Nevertheless, the committee notes that the Scottish Government is likely to need to find around £1 billion across the next 3 financial years to repay negative income tax reconciliations. Now, certainly.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the committee convener for giving way. Would he agree with me that another strong theme in the evidence that the committee has taken from a wide range of sources is that these uncertainties are made worse because of the order in which we're doing things, of having to pass a Scottish budget and then a UK budget? Does he agree with me that the witnesses we've heard from will find it unacceptable if we're forced into that situation in the context of next year's budgetary constraints?
I'm going to address that matter specifically, and I think the witnesses did make comment like that. Now, the Scottish Government, of course, does have 2 additional budget management tools to help manage this increased volatility. First, the power to borrow up to £600 million each year, with an overall limit of £1.75 billion. Second, a reserve with an overall cap of £700 million, with an annual drawdown limits of £250 million for resource and £100 million for capital spending. Now, the Scottish Government's view is that given the far greater than anticipated volatility, these powers are insufficient. And while the fiscal framework is due to be reviewed in 2022, ministers have asked HM Treasury to extend the resource borrowing and reserve powers in the short term. And the committee has invited the Treasury to consider the findings of our budget report when responding to that request. However, Presiding Officer, this does not answer the question I posed earlier. Indeed, if HM Treasury were to agree to increase borrowing and reserve powers, it makes the question more immediate. Do we want to consider, as a whole Parliament, that it might now be more prudent, when additional funding becomes available, to build up a reserve to deal with future volatility? Alternatively, are we content that all the new and additional funding is allocated and that we deal with future volatility as and when it arises? The forecast negative reconciliation of £550 million for 2018-19 is likely to present the Scottish Government and this Parliament with a significant challenge in setting next year's budget. The Cabinet Secretary suggested to the committee that the Scottish Government, were the Scottish Government to build up significant reserve, there would be accusations that she was not using the Government's resources as well as she could. And I think today might well demonstrate the Cabinet Secretary made a fair point. The use of the reserve, therefore, raises the wider question about the need for a more strategic approach to budget management and the Government's medium-term financial strategy, or MTFS. Now, in our budget report, the committee indicated that we were somewhat disappointed in the lack of information in the MTFS regarding how the forecast £1 billion negative reconciliation would be addressed. In response, the Scottish Government stated its position that decisions on management of income tax reconciliations can only be taken in each budget year. Now, I think the committee asks reasonably, how this approach is consistent with the principles and priorities set out in the MTFS, which appear to provide the basis for a strategic approach to the management of reconciliations. The committee also asks how the Government will seek to find an appropriate balance between increasing the size of the reserve and/or committing to further public expenditure. Now, Presiding Officer, the committee recognises there will always be political pressures to allocate all available resources on an annual basis, but both the Government and the Parliament as a whole now need to seriously consider whether this is a sustainable approach. The committee believes that the possibility needs to be considered of shifting from an annual focus on allocations to a more medium-term approach. The committee therefore recommends that the next MTFS should seek to set out the basis for a more strategic approach to budgetary management, which seeks to address medium-term volatility and risk. In addition, the possibility of multi-annual budgets for public bodies should be considered. That being said, the committee fully recognises this will be a significant challenge given the lack of a recent UK comprehensive spending review and for some of the reasons outlined by Patrick Harvey earlier. Presiding Officer, I recognise this will not be easy, and it will not be easy to engender a meaningful and wider debate on this issue, but I live in hope. And I should warn the Parliament, the challenges the committee has identified will not go away. Come December, it's likely the Government will need to find around £500 million to address negative reconciliation. So, Presiding Officer, there will also come a point in future budgets when the Parliament need to decide how to deal with positive reconciliations that could be substantial. Should any additional funding be spent, or should it be kept in reserve to pay for future negative reconciliations? The answers will depend on our collective willingness to engage constructively on whether it is now prudent to plan beyond a one-year budget horizon. Presiding Officer, a report is intended to contribute positively to that debate. And in conclusion, can I thank our committee clerking team and our adviser David Eisner for their highly professional and considered input into the preparation of the report. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call on Sarah Boyack to open for the Labour Party.
Very much, Presiding Officer. While we welcome the opportunity to meet with the new Cabinet Secretary and we welcome her to her post in her first budget, we do believe that this budget is a disappointment. It is full of smoke and mirrors, and it's all about the headlines, not about the reality on the ground. And it comes at an absolutely critical time for Scotland. 13 years of mismanagement and underinvestment from the SNP, and again, this budget does not deliver the transformational change Scotland needs. So before the celebrations begin on the SNP and Green benches, let's be clear, there will be cuts in our communities following today's budget. A decade of underfunding and austerity has come with a hefty price tag. 10,000 full-time jobs are equivalent, which is 33,000 redundancies in our communities, job losses for people that they've had to deal with. And it's fascinating to hear the Tories saying that austerity is over. Well, it's taken them a long time, 10 years, and we haven't seen the evidence yet. We want to see the actual consequences, because the worry is, with the new consequentials coming down the track, that there will be smoke and mirrors there too. And I think there's a procedural issue for us to be able to look at those consequentials when they're actually in place. There is no doubt, no, I need to go on, I'll come in a minute, we're in a climate emergency. Our further and higher education services are under pressure. Our local councils' finances are teetering on a cliff edge as the demand for social care is soaring and impacting on our NHS. And we've had a decade of Scottish austerity. Inequality is growing, poverty has become normalised, food banks have grown in response to the erosion of the safety net, which our councils play a key role in delivering. They are in the front line of delivering against inequality, supporting our communities and giving our young people the chances they need to succeed in life. Now, today the Cabinet Secretary is asking us to celebrate the additional £95 million for local government found behind the sofa for today's debate. I suspect that is going to be the image that lasts for all of us. But that £95 million was just the gap, the underfunded element in the Scottish Government's own commitments that had to be delivered by local government. So they should have been in the budget in the first place. And that's why we asked for fair funding for local government, to stop the cuts and then to ensure that the investment was there to deliver on that programme. But even with the additional money added in, which the Cabinet Secretary announced yesterday, there will be still tough decisions being made by our councillor colleagues across country. And our councillor colleagues are working hard, but without the investment desperately needed. So they are having to make tough choices. The SNP government controls the purse strings, but they don't take responsibility for their cuts. And it's not just revenue expenditure. The cuts in capital funding of £117 million mean that the transformation we need in our schools and council buildings and the investment to meet our future needs are going to be tough to make. I know in my own council, Edinburgh alone, that bill for school buildings and council buildings to refurbish our existing schools and build new schools to meet the additional population we have means that our council will need to borrow £260 million to meet that £570 million bill. And that will cost an additional £17.5 million annually in revenue spend that they will have to find. Now, the SNP make a big play about money for the NHS, but we've got mismanagement of that precious resource on an unprecedented scale. Cuts to IGBs, the loss of key staff in leadership positions, 6 of our mainland health boards in special measures, and staff in frontline positions under increasing pressure, and patients waiting longer to get access to GP services or just to get treated. Now, when I asked the Cabinet Secretary in our local government committee whether the budget would solve our social care crisis and end delayed discharge, she could not answer me. And that's because so much of the additional resource she wanted to talk about is already ring-fenced and does not deal with the growing social care crisis that we see across our communities. And the lack of investment in preventative spend is an issue that the Local Government and Communities Committee has been taking evidence on. So this is not just an issue from COSLA, this is an issue that many organisations are making key representations on. And if you look, yes, we'll take that point.
John Mason. I thank the member very much for giving way. I think a lot of us agree with her point that there should be more in preventative spend, but would she accept there needs to then be disinvestment from other services? And that's the problem. We have to take it off the hospitals or somewhere.
Senator Boyack.
No, it's about making the money that is spent actually deliver in practice. Look at the non-core local government budgets that are going to be cut. Libraries, sports and leisure facilities, recycling, parks and green spaces. They're the bedrock of our communities, but they're also crucial to developing the health and well-being of our communities. And the key issue about well-being is it is not actually properly monitored. All of those issues, all the non-core local government budgets are absolutely vital if we're going to see the deepening inequalities and poverty being experienced in our communities being addressed. And crucially also, the cuts are going to undermine the important work of the third sector in our communities. And while we welcome the child payment, it simply doesn't go far enough, as 210,000 children will still be living in poverty, with 65% of those parents in working household. So we'll not see the investment from our local councils that they urgently need in economic development and local transport infrastructure. And I just want to pick up on the irony of the Greens backing down on their big climate infrastructure demands and being happy at their top-up £15 million for cycling at a time when the roads cyclists use daily are being damaged by potholes growing at an alarming rate. It's looking increasingly like the Greens are the green wing of the SNP, not standing up for their core principles. Yes, I will.
Ross Greer.
I'm very grateful for that intervention. From hundreds of millions of pounds put back into local government to free bus travel for young people, including 150,000 in the Lothians, is Sarah Boyack not embarrassed that the Greens are delivering more Labour policy than the Labour Party are?
Sarah Boyack.
The hundreds of millions of extra pounds going into local government, I don't think so, not from the announcement we've had. And we're disappointed. We're disappointed at the timid, in-principle commitment for free bus travel for the under-18s. Let's hope this fares better than last year's Green Deal, which was meant to secure a 3-year funding deal for local government. Not happening anytime soon. Labour wanted an expansion to the under-25s. That would include, no thank you, students in further and higher education, young people in work, taking financial pressure off them, giving them the affordable, greener options to travel, and to help turn the tide of bus passenger reduction as we try to address our climate emergency. So the celebration will not include the 414,000 young people who will miss out. This needed to be a radical transformation budget to tackle poverty, to create the new jobs and deliver the infrastructure investment we need to tackle our climate emergency and to build the community services we need across Scotland. It doesn't go far enough. It passes on cuts to our local communities. Scotland's people deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Patrick Harvey to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Nobody would expect to have to step in and take over the budget process at the very last minute, not least in these unprecedented situations of having to pass a Scottish budget before the UK budget. Kate Forbes has stepped into that role with professionalism, and I thank her for her engagement during the process. Greens have always believed that our responsibility as an opposition party is to put positive ideas on the table and find ways to make them workable to achieve an impact for people across Scotland. And that's what we've achieved since the SNP lost its majority in 2016. We've made a real impact in local government in particular. And yes, I recognise that Sarah Boyack has only just happily rejoined us in the Parliament, but since 2016, hundreds of millions of pounds have gone back into local government compared with the cuts proposed in draft budgets as published. We shouldn't be in the situation of having to have that discussion every single year, and a UK spending review is long overdue, which would allow multi-year settlements in Scotland again. Very briefly, yeah.
Sarah Boyack.
I just want to know how happy he is about the cuts to non-ring-fenced revenue funding of nearly £900 million in real terms since 2013. Surely we cannot celebrate that.
Patrick Harvey.
Since 2013, that's particularly the point. Since the SNP lost the majority in 2016, there has been a significant change. The most recent of which is the reversal of £95 million. And just less than an hour before this budget agreement was published, COSLA put out a press release complaining about a £95 million cut to revenue, and that was been reversed in this budget. Will I claim that it achieves perfection? No, it doesn't achieve perfection, but it makes a real, substantial difference, and it will make a lasting impact for people across Scotland. As a result of the additional revenue funding in Edinburgh, Green councillors have proposed more funding for schools, nursery teachers, climate targets, planting trees, renewable energy and making the capital more wildlife friendly. In Aberdeenshire, the Democratic, Independent and Green Group have proposed that 17 secondary teacher posts and 25 pupil support assistant posts be reinstated. And in Glasgow, the Green councillors have already secured their own, not for the moment, their own budget amendment to the SNP's budget, once again showing that not at the moment, thank you, that an SNP administration needs to be pushed beyond its comfort zone, while also rejecting Glasgow Labour's proposals to slash teacher numbers across the city. And the extra funding will allow us to go further and faster, and means that we can propose that the Blair Vaddock Outdoor Centre can and should be protected. I give way on that point.
Jackie Bailey.
I welcome any U-turn on the part of the Greens because, of course, in Glasgow City Council, the Greens voted with the SNP to close Blair Vaddock Outdoor Education Centre, denying thousands of children outdoor education.
Patrick Harvey.
Jackie Bailey might have been misinformed by her Glasgow Labour councillors. That wouldn't be out of character for them, but the Blair Vaddock proposal was in the SNP budget, not in the Green amendment. Capital resource is also a serious issue
for local government, and the extra cash for active travel, taking that to £100 million for active travel, as well as energy efficiency, will also support local government action. We will need to wait till the UK budget is out to know what the full consequences will be, and nobody could be in any doubt that this absurd situation of forcing councils to set their budgets first, then the Scottish Government, then the UK, is intolerable. This does need to be, this does need to be a climate emergency budget, and the proposal, groundbreaking proposal on free bus travel for everybody aged 18 and younger will make a massive difference. For some students in Scotland, they're paying upwards of £1,000 a year just to get to college. A student travelling from Bathgate to Edinburgh College's Granton campus will save over £1,200 in an academic year. And there are many other examples from around the country. I have one colleague from the south of Scotland, I think from Findlay Carson's constituency. Findlay Carson has been criticising this deal because it offers nothing for rural areas. She said, frankly giddy about free bus travel for the kids. Last time we did a family bus trip, it cost £34, and that wasn't even to our nearest large town. Good work, Scott GP, will make a huge difference to young people and low-income families in rural areas. These proposals will make a substantial difference. And young people are discriminated against in the UK minimum wage as well. They earn less than older workers. Vast numbers of employers in retail and hospitality pay young people poverty wages, and the legal minimum is lowest for youngest workers. So we'll go further in future. We'll propose expanding on this scheme to ensure that fare free public transport is available for all, certainly including everybody under 25. But this is a huge first step in that direction, and it's welcome that green pressure has made this happen. I want to say something finally, Presiding Officer, about the wider infrastructure project, because the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland has made recommendations which sound strikingly like Green Party policy for the last 20 years. It's about not building more capacity, but improving the infrastructure that we've had. It's about saying a presumption against new capacity in the road network. And the SNP, I'm sorry to say, have so far refused to follow through this logic, as have the other opposition parties. But there is now a major question over Sheriff Hall. And we believe that a review, if properly conducted, will result in alternatives that will actually take traffic levels down instead of increasing them. Every political party in this chamber, Presiding Officer, uses the rhetoric of climate emergency. But last year, we saw that opportunism will always be too tempting for some. The truth is that the Greens have been saying for decades what the ICS are now proposing, and no other political party has been with us on that. Some have still not moved on from the days when every other party in this chamber was backing absurd projects like the M74 Northern Extension. Though we have made significant progress with this budget agreement, all too often this criticism is levelled at the SNP as well. Today's Heathrow ruling is critical for the Scottish Government as well. It's not just about one airport. It sets a precedent that all government infrastructure decisions must be compatible with the Climate Change Act. It may well be that in future the Scottish Government will need to be held to account in court, just as the UK Government was today. For the time being, this budget agreement sets important steps forward for young people accessing public transport, to shift that transport demand away from private car use and save families money, as well as putting investment into the other climate emergency priorities that the Greens have set out. I welcome the fact that that agreement has been reached, and I hope, for goodness sake, that the UK Government next year will not force us into this absurd situation again of having to debate a budget before we know what the consequences are of their decisions.
Really ready to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to pay tribute to Kate Forbes to start off with. I find her very polite and respectful when we have discussions. Even when we strongly disagree on things, she's always respectful, and I appreciate that, because it does make for a more conducive environment for having a constructive discussion, which she rightly, I think, said in her letter that I received yesterday, equally in the same format, where she was respectful for the constructive way that I think all the parties, as she said, have engaged in this budget discussion. I think she's got a difficult job ahead of her, particularly with some of the legacy issues that she's having to deal with, particularly when Our Power, the £10 million loan, was lost with the collapse of that organisation. The AWPR, which is £65 million over budget. The Agricultural Payments IT system was about £180 million. The Sick Kids Hospital here in Edinburgh, around about £90 million. The ferries, we know through in the West, which has effectively doubled in the cost of that. But also the hospitals up in Aberdeen, which is estimated to be £35 million over budget. So quite a considerable legacy for the Finance Secretary to be able to deal with. But also the fundamentals of the way that our public services are working as a result of some of the decisions that her government has taken over those years, including in particular on the lack of proper investment in mental health services that's causing considerable cost to the rest of the health service and to the wider public services too, as we've seen with our police, our teachers and many other public services too. But also social care, as we know there's a massive backlog in social care packages in many areas across the country. In fact, we heard just yesterday about the IGB in Fife that's got a considerable deficit. So there's some fundamentals in the way that our public services are working that means that it's a difficult job for Kate Forbes to be able to secure a budget that's balanced and is effective. But let this be the last year that we can do away with the charade that the government has left no flexibility at all for any other parties to put forward priorities that they would like to see reflected in the budget. Let the idea that there is no magic money tree has just gone. The emerging underspends was the new phrase that appeared this year. The sudden Barnett consequentials, the non-domestic rates reprofiling. These are the phrases that we're familiar with in some previous years, but I know we'll be wise to again in future years. She said there was no magic money tree, but she's been given a good big whack with a big stick. So we've seen that argument, I think, has fallen. She was either bluffing or she was incredibly brave, but in the end she was just bluffing. And that's what we have found out. Now, we put forward reasonable and measured proposals in this budget. There were a number of fundamental disagreements that we've had, as I've highlighted, in terms of the overspend on several capital projects and the way that mental health services have been working and social care as well. But we're, in the context of this budget, we're prepared to put forward costed and reasonable proposals. We look to the COSLA advice about the £95 million shortfall that they saw in the revenue, but £117 million on the capital that the Finance Secretary has not addressed. But that was just to meet the government's promises that they have made on behalf of local government. This is not local government promises, these are government promises. So at the very least, they should have been met already within the budget. The £595 million that COSLA identified should have been in the fundamental part of the budget, but they never were. It should never have been up to other parties to make the case for the government to meet the promises that it's made in previous years. So forgive me for not accepting that this is enough, because we know that the £200 million inflation cost that is also not included in the government's budget will be a direct impact on local government services. We will see more services closing. We will see it more difficult to fund the education that we need to supply in our schools, and that's already struggling. We'll see it much more difficult to provide the social care packages and the social fabric in our local communities. So forgive me for not thinking that that is enough. But also on the police made, they've been in a terrible condition. We've seen the reports about the state of police stations. I'm afraid that small amount of money of £5 million will not deal with the legacy issues that we've got in our police estate. So we should have seen far more in that too. I think there's still a £20 million shortfall from what the Police Federation were highlighting should have been the basics that was included in the budget. And the Finance Secretary criticises those for believing that independence is not a good idea. She criticises me for expecting her just in this 1 year to accept that independence referendum is not going to happen. because we know it's not going to happen. We know that's the reality. So I don't know why the Finance Secretary is holding back funds, not just now, is holding back funds for that possibility when everybody knows it's not going to happen. I'm not expecting her, not just now, I'm not expecting her to give up on believing in independence. I've never expected her to do that, just as much as she wouldn't expect me to give up on believing that the United Kingdom is the best constitutional future. But to hold back money for something that's not going to happen, I think is a complete and utter waste of money. And I think the Finance Secretary should reflect on that. And I'll take a short intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't criticise Willie Rennie for believing in the union. What I criticise is the fact that he prioritises the union over funding for education, infrastructure, mental health and everything else in this budget.
Willie Rennie.
That would have some merit if the Finance Secretary was not holding back funds for a possible independence referendum this year. That is not going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. So why are we doing that? Why are we wasting that money? That money could go into the police. That money could go into councils. She's putting the Constitution ahead of the priorities for this country, and that is something that she should reflect on. So I hope that the Finance Secretary has learnt a lot from this process, because I'm sure everyone in this chamber has learnt a lot. The one thing, above all else, is that we must make sure that our public services, our health services, our education system, all of those things must be properly funded, and I'm afraid with this budget they certainly are not.
Thank you very much to all our opening speakers. Before we enter the open part of the debate, just let members know that we've actually used up most of the flexible time for interventions and so on. So I don't want to discourage interventions, quite the reverse. Could I ask all contributors from now on to reduce their speeches from 6 minutes to 5 minutes if they possibly can, and that will give us time for interventions. So trim your remarks, and then we'll have time for an actual debate. If not, I will have to drop speakers or take it off the closing speakers. So on that note, can I call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Jamie Green? Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the uncertainty over Brexit and the problems created by the delay in the UK budget, I'm sure that this Scottish budget will be welcomed as it delivers some certainty to local government, the health service and business. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government and the Green Party have reached an agreement that boosts support for our young people, our police, climate action and local government. And as one of our esteemed journalists said on Twitter, I have no doubt that if the Tories, Labour or the Lib Dems had secured the same budget deals as the Scottish Greens, they'd be hailing it as a great victory. Presiding Officer, COSLA called for an extra £95 million. The Scottish Government has listened and delivered. There were calls for free bus travel for young people. The Scottish Government has listened and will deliver. And there were calls for an extra £50 million for Police Scotland. The Scottish Government has again listened and delivered £60 million. Presiding Officer, understandably, I think the most recurring ask from every party was for additional funding for our local authorities. Our local authorities provide some of the most crucial frontline services day in and day out. We all know that too well. So I hope that everyone can get behind the £95 million of additional funding for local government, which takes total Scottish Government support for local authorities to more than £500 million. From my constituents in Edinburgh Pentlands, they will benefit from our own council receiving an additional £7.4 million in the next year. I also welcome the proposal to introduce free bus travel to all young people below the age of 19. In Edinburgh and the Lothians, over 110,000 young people could benefit, including nearly 13,000 youngsters in my constituency of Edinburgh Pentlands when it is introduced in 2021. As someone who spent over 20 years in public transport, I know the enormous benefit free travel brought to those aged over 60, and I welcome it now that it is being extended to our young people. Who knows, hopefully we might even see a reduction in the number of cars on the school run, especially in Edinburgh with our award-winning bus company, Lothian Buses. Presiding Officer, further education, including Edinburgh College, where I, an Education Cabinet Secretary, recently attended a celebration of its 50th birthday, is set to benefit from the largest funding increase in the college sector in over 10 years. This investment has been welcomed by the sector, with Shona Struthers, Chief Executive of Colleges Scotland, stating, it is extremely pleasing that the Scottish Government clearly recognises the critical important role colleges have in delivering the skills and qualifications for almost 265,000 learners to develop their careers and the positive impact those institutions have across Scotland's communities and how they help increase inclusive economic growth. She went on to say that the college sector's revenue resource budget has increased by £33.5 million to £640 million, a real terms rise of around 3.6%. Another important sector for Edinburgh and my constituency is tourism, as over 33,000 of the capital's citizens are employed to provide services to the 4.3 million people who visit this city each year, spending around £4 million in the city each day. This budget recognises that importance, and don't take my word on that. Mark Crothall, Chief Exec of the Scottish Tourism Alliance, has said that the Scottish Tourism Alliance welcomes announcements made in the draft budget, many of which have been outlined clearly in our direct ask to the Scottish Government on behalf of Scotland's tourism industry. He continued, "We are encouraged that the supportive measures for businesses announced today, one of which will see 95% of properties paying a lower poundage in business rates than the rest of the UK, in addition to business rates relief for many businesses." And in Matt Crothall's words, this is hugely positive news for the tourism sector, and in particular, I'm sure that many of our businesses will welcome the opportunity to capitalise on this relief and turn thoughts towards investment in their product and people. Presiding Officer, I've only had time to touch on some of the commitments in this budget. It also delivers a record £15 billion for health and care services, provides over £3 billion of social security payments, delivers £201 million to secure the full rollout of increased early learning and childcare provision, invests over £100 million to address the poverty-related attainment gap in schools, and provides £20 million for the Scottish Child Payment to support our wider action to address child poverty. All commitments that will make sure that Scotland is one of the best places to live and work. In closing, I want to iterate that this budget delivers on key issues raised by all parties in this chamber, and all of us should unite behind it and deliver for the people of Scotland.
Thank you very much, Mr MacDonald. I call Jamie Green to be followed by Alec Neil. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming Kate Forbes to her new role as Finance Secretary? It will come as no surprise to members that I will focus my comments today on the budgetary aspects of education and skills. Because quite simply, I think at the core of any strong economy lies the simple truth that the current and future generations of young Scots get the best start in life, from early years right through to ongoing adult learning and everything in between. Arguably, Presiding Officer, is one of the most humbling of portfolios to hold in politics. Arguably, it should be any government's #1 priority. Arguably, this government has taken its eye off the ball. But let me start with some positives. There are parts of this budget that I welcome when it comes to some of its initiatives to tackle the attainment gap, to fund childcare, to improve the skill set of our workforce, and of course, teachers' pay. But warm words, manifesto commitments and budgetary promises are one thing, delivering them is another. And this week should serve as a stark reminder to all of us in this chamber of what happens when the policy delivery doesn't match the promises. Tell that to those who didn't get the results that they were expecting in last year's higher exams. The stark reality is that our educational institutions have been under tremendous pressure for some time. And improving our education system requires not just political will, but vision. So what does the budget do to address that? Well, let's look at teacher numbers. There's been a recruitment issue for many years in Scotland. In fact, research last year found that rural Scotland has some of the most severe teacher shortages in the whole of Europe. Now, I welcome any proposed rise in teacher salaries. There's no question that they deserve to be recognised for the work that they do. And the Scottish Government will probably argue in that context that that is sufficient. But this rise comes after salaries were capped at 1%, well below the rate of inflation for a decade. This increase also comes after two successive budgets, which saw teachers' taxes rise, despite an explicit and firm promise by the Deputy First Minister in 2016 that he would not allow this to happen. Let me finish. Anyone earning over £27,000 in Scotland is deemed to be rich by this government. Make of that what you will. But it's not just about levels of compensation. It's about the well-being of our teachers as well. The OECD found that Scottish teachers work some of the longest teaching hours of any in the developed world. And a recent review found that 60% of teachers have reported that the work has impacted their mental health, and this shows no sign of slowing down. A recent... I will on that issue.
John Swinney. I wonder if Mr Green would explain to Parliament his proposals advanced to the Finance Secretary that would have reduced the class contact time for teachers in this budget negotiation. Jamie Green.
Mr Swinney knows fine well that teachers are under tremendous pressure. It doesn't help them, if I may, it doesn't help them when teachers are teaching multi-level classes with 2, 3 or 4 levels of teaching in one classroom. The pressure that is putting on them, it has to change. And the way to fix that, Mr Swinney, is to get more teachers in schools, as simple as that. How is multi-level teaching conducive to a positive work environment for students or teachers? Answer that question, Mr Swinney. On early learning and childcare, this is an important issue. The Scottish Government will rightly point out that their commitment on the expansion of early learning and childcare. Now, these benches welcome those principles. That early intervention will give children the best start, but it's not just about promising the money or signing the cheques. We need to make sure that the expansion work on the ground itself takes place. We know that 71% of private nurseries have current recruitment issues. 40% of partner providers in the private and third sector simply cannot cover their costs of delivering these services with the rates that they're getting from local authorities. There's a huge squeeze on places. Parents know that, and the Cabinet Secretary must know that as well. On higher funding and further education, I could go into a lot of detail, but let's not forget that in 2019, Audit Scotland said that the Scottish Government capital funding falls well short of what is needed to meet the estimated costs of maintaining the college estate. The same is true of universities, where Scottish applicants are missing out on places due to current structures. Universities are increasingly reliant on fee-paying students from other parts of the UK, or indeed outside of the EU itself. There is a funding crisis in education which has been bubbling along for years, but no one wants to touch, such is the nature of the Pandora's box it might open. But what I will say on this issue, what I will say today, it is my firm belief that no Scot, whatever their background, should be denied a place at a Scottish college or university where that place is deserved, wanted and merited. Presiding Officer, this budget, like many before it, is very much status quo when it comes to education, but the status quo will not deliver the next generation of teachers, nurses, doctors or engineers that we need. If this government does not make education its #1 priority, we certainly will. I support the amendment and Donald Cameron's name.
Thank you very much. I call Alec Neil to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by congratulating Kate Forbes in getting off to a brilliant start as the new Finance Secretary. And can I say that her performance last week and today has fully justified her elevation to the Cabinet. The one downside of that, of course, is that the Cabinet is no longer gender balanced. 7 women and 5 men, 2 vacancies for men. So I say to Bruce Crawford and to Richard Lyle and to all those men announcing their retirement, you've missed your opportunity. You could be in the Cabinet to help rebalance it. Not a mistake I will make, Presiding Officer. But let me be serious for a minute. I've been sitting here listening to the Tory spokespeople and the Labour spokespeople. And I think it's time we got some intellectual honesty into the argument. The Tory party, the Unionist party, is complaining because we're not spending more money on education. We're not spending more money on local government. We're not spending more money on social care. Can I say to the Tory spokespeople, we would be able to do all of that, but we have had our budget cut in real terms by £1.5 billion a year by a Tory government in London. Of course, Mr Green, stand up again I'll take your intervention.
Jamie Green.
I'm sure Mr Neil will therefore welcome the £1.5 billion he's getting from the UK Government to help fund public services in Scotland. Go on, stand up and welcome it. Let's hear it.
Alec Neil.
Yes, we're all against some of our own money back. But at least be honest, it's the Tory party that is the cause of the problem because of their austerity cuts over 10 years. But I also say to the other big unionist party, a bit of oh, of course, got to get easier by the minute.
Liam Kerr.
It's just to ask Mr Neil, if his government can spend millions more on bus passes, why has the government not been able to find only 15 million to support much-needed residential drug rehab beds?
Alec Neil.
You can't money twice. If you're spending it on one thing, you ask your wife, you can't spend it on something else. You can't spend the money twice. If we didn't have a cut of £1.5 billion, we could do all of these things. And let's talk to the Labour Party as well, because there has to be a degree of intellectual honesty from the front bench of the Labour Party. Let us first of all... Now, I wish Miss Bailey, I know she's running for Deputy Leader, and then no doubt she'll get rid of Mr Leonard from the leadership. But let me say to Jackie Bailey, don't get too het up, because these cuts actually didn't start with the Tories. They started with Alistair Darling. And you may remember, Presiding Officer, that Alistair Darling is also the man when he was the Social Security Secretary. And this devolved Parliament took a devolved decision to introduce free personal care, and Alistair Darling stripped our people of £140 million in social security benefit because we dared take a decision opposed by the Labour Cabinet in London. So we won't be taking any lectures from the Labour Party, because they started the cuts, they paved the way for the Tory cuts, and in their Better Together campaign, when they were joined at the hip, they effectively gave intellectual support to the Tory cuts and the austerity agenda. Now, the most important speech actually so far, Presiding Officer, apart from this one, has been that made by Bruce Crawford. When you listen, Presiding Officer, to what Bruce Crawford is convener of the Finance Committee, and he'll be sorely missed in this Parliament when he leaves. But as convener of the Finance Committee, he has spelt out some home truths that everybody in this Parliament will need to face up to in the months and years ahead. We're effectively, through the fiscal framework, going to lose £1 billion over the next 3 years. That's on top of the austerity cuts we've already had. And if you look at the implications of the demand-led social security bill and the changes to the block grant, this Parliament faces a real potential financial crisis. And I believe that what the new Finance Secretary must do is a number of things, starting with asking the new Chancellor in London to bring forward the review of the fiscal framework from 2022 to now, because this country cannot take another round of cuts imposed in this case as a result of a financial framework that, in my view, has now become very detrimental to the people of Scotland. And it's the people we have to think of. So thank you, Presiding Officer. We face these challenges, and unfortunately I can't take Sarah Boyack.
Because the member is sitting down. Thank you very much, Mr. Neil. I remind members it's 5-minute speeches, but obviously I allow time for interventions. Mr. Neil took 2 interventions. It is a debate. It makes it lively. I call Colin Smith, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Finance Secretary may have changed, but the annual ritual has stayed the same. The SNP published their draft budget, then they tell us there's no more money, take it or leave it. Or in the words of Kate Forbes, when I say that I've deployed every penny in the face of the budget, I mean that I've deployed every penny. We have deployed every penny. But then we wait a couple of weeks, and hey presto, the pennies drop. And a few £1 million suddenly appear. I'll take an intervention, yeah.
Cabinet Secretary.
We had and we have deployed every penny on the face of the budget. The nature of going ahead of the UK Government's budget is that we are dealing with estimates for consequentials and we've reviewed our forecast. The answer remains the same.
Colin Smith.
Presiding Officer, I have to say the Cabinet Secretary was very clear that suddenly there were underspends and then suddenly there was rates reprofiling, which she didn't seem to know about just a few weeks ago. I'm sorry, this money conveniently hid down the back of the magic money sofa year in, year out, continues, frankly, to mislead people. However, the proposed changes to the draft budget today are still less than 0.5% of the overall budget. And when we look back on this Parliament, when we take stock of the 4 SNP Green budgets we've had, they will be remembered for the biggest sustained attack on council services in living memory. When SNP and Green MSPs rubber stamp the budget today, they will do so as councillors the length and breadth of Scotland are wrestling with the menu of painful cuts they still need to make. Which of their local community services are they going to cut? Which of their neighbours' jobs will they axe? How much will they hike the regressive council tax, knowing they'll be delivering fewer services because the SNP and Greens refuse to use the powers of this Parliament to vary income tax rates for those at the very top? While SNP and Green MSPs pat themselves in the back in this debate in this chamber, the debate taking place in council chambers after 4 years of budgets by the SNP and Greens is not about which services to trim, it's about which services to scrap. The Cabinet Secretary said she's given councils the £95 million revenue funding COSLA asked for. Well, let me tell her exactly what COSLA said. In the report Invest in Essential Services, published last month, they laid bare the financial crisis facing councils who have had to make £2.1 billion of cuts since 2012. This week, they confirmed that as a result of the Scottish Government's draft budget, they were £300 million, not £95 million, short in real terms, just for councils to stand still, never mind reverse the cuts of the past. And it's not just councils' revenue funding that's been slashed in the budget, it's also their capital funding. The funding that rebuilds our crumbling schools, resurfaces our pothole-plagued roads and delivers the parks and leisure centres at the heart of our communities. That budget has been cut by £117 million in cash terms alone this year. Presiding Officer, it really is an insult to the hard-working council staff who teach our children, who care for our loved ones as if they are their own, for the SNP and Greens to claim in this budget they have given councils the funding they asked for, when they know that as a result of today's budget there will be more council jobs acts on top of the nearly 40,000 lost since 2007. And just as austerity was a political choice of the Tories, it is the political choices of the SNP and Greens and their budgets that's caused those job losses in councils and cuts in local services. I'll take an intervention, yes.
Claudia Beamish.
Member for taking an intervention. On Monday, I met with community councillors from Biggar and Cwth in my region. They experienced cuts, cancellations and delays to bus services. Does the member agree with me that for councils to create bus companies for our communities and not for profit, there must be funding for this?
Colin Smith.
Thank Claudia Beamish for that intervention. I think Claudia Beamish raises an important point. As a result of Labour's amendments to the Transport Bill, councils will soon have the power to set up and run their own local bus services. The problem is there isn't a single penny in this budget from the Scottish Government that will enable that power to be used to reverse the massive decline we've seen in bus routes under this Government. Presiding Officer, this budget was an opportunity to change direction, to bring an end to that austerity-driven record and pursue a progressive vision for the future. But in reality, it's turned out to be more of the same. More timidness, more mismanagement and more cuts. As the Cabinet Secretary has said, Labour did engage positively in proposing a number of changes to the budget, but ultimately we were undercut by a Green Party willing to settle for less local government funding, less for young people and less for Scotland. And that's seen in one of the positive measures that I support, and that's the move towards free bus travel for young people. I welcome any step in that direction.
towards Labour's policy of free travel for under 25s. When we brought this issue to Parliament in March last year, and the only debate there's been on the issue, every single SNP MSP voted against our proposal. Some even questioned whether young people were in need of such support. So I welcome the positive change in policy. But I hope the Cabinet Secretary will make clear today that every single young person under 19 will have free bus travel by the beginning of January 2021, because that's not clear from the budget proposal. The Government argues the work still needs to be done, but this Parliament voted in March last year to consider the costs and benefits of extended free bus travel to young people. And
no,
I wonder, frankly,
will have to wind up.
What the Government has been doing in that time. Presiding Officer, if we really want to unlock opportunities for all of Scotland's young people, we should be delivering free bus travel for all under 25s, because yesterday's Scottish transport statistics showed the scale of the challenge we face. Bus passenger numbers in Scotland have plummeted by 8 million a year and by 107 million journeys since the SNP came to power. If we're serious about climate change, we have to get serious about supporting public transport, in particular of bus services. One way to do that, Presiding Officer, is to build on the success of Labour's bus pass for older people, extend it not just to some young people, but to all young people. By doing so, it will deliver the real transformational change we need to halt the dismantling of our bus network taking place under this government.
Thank you very much. I call Joan McAlpine, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The headline from this budget is understandably the Government's investment in environmental justice, and I want to focus my remarks today also on the Government's continuing commitment to social justice, because, of course, environmental justice and social justice are closely linked. In the rural parts of the South Scotland region I represent, transport costs are a real challenge for people on low incomes, for young people in particular. The cost of commuting to work or education is very high. So I very much welcome the commitment to deliver a national concessionary travel scheme offering free bus travel for under 18s by January 2021. In Dumfries and Galloway alone, 20,000 young people are set to benefit from this measure. Also tackling social and environmental justice at the same time is the £151 million in this budget for energy efficiency, and I particularly welcome the £25 million of additional investment in local government energy efficiency measures to tackle fuel poverty, which again is a huge challenge in areas of rural Scotland where people whose incomes are well below the national average live off the gas grid, that is, in homes that are hard to heat. So it's a real triple whammy. That brings me to a major ongoing social justice commitment of this government, which this budget delivers, and that is the commitment to create 50,000 affordable homes in the lifetime of this Parliament. Some said it could not be done, but it's well on track, thanks to the energy and commitment of this SNP government, and particularly the Housing Minister, Kevin Stuart. This year, there is an £800 million to deliver on that commitment, plus a further £300 million to ensure building continues once this target is reached. I saw the results of the house building programme myself just this week when I joined Kevin Stuart on a visit to a new development of 27 homes just off the High Street in the town of Annan. It was a derelict industrial site and it has been transformed. The 19th century sandstone buildings that face onto the High Street have been restored as new homes. So the placemaking and town centre regeneration are enhanced. And the high-quality new-build terraced houses have solar panels and very high levels of modern insulation, as well as several being adapted for people with disabilities. So again, we see social justice and climate justice delivered. But more than that, the house building programme is so important in terms of delivering on commitments to sustainable and inclusive economic growth. That development in Annan, which I mentioned, alone saw £2.17 million invested by the Scottish Government and another £1.5 million raised by the developer Cunningham Housing Association. And the main contractor was a local builder, Ashley Homes, and they in turn used several local subcontractors. That's a very, very big investment in quite a small community, and it's not the only one that's happening. Our house building programme supports and creates jobs, and because of the Annan development and several others across Dumfries and Galloway that Cunningham are undertaking with Ashley, Ashley have been able to take on additional 2 apprentices each year. Again, in a rural economy, that is a really, really big commitment and makes a real difference to people's lives. And behind every house, there's a human story, not just for people who live in the house, but by people who benefit in terms of jobs from the house building programme. Yes.
Kevin Stuart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Ms McAlpine for giving way. And I had great pleasure in joining her in Annan on Monday. And I'm very pleased that she's mentioned Cunningham Housing Association and Ashley Builders, because they have been absolutely fantastic in Ayrshire and in the South West of Scotland. Ms McAlpine mentioned the job situation. The current programme sustains 12 to 14,000 jobs. But one of the good things is the apprenticeships, including a large amount of women apprentices that are now entering the trade. And I pay tribute to Ashley, and I'm sure that Ms McAlpine would too, in attracting young women to the construction industry.
Ms McAlpine.
That is fantastic, and I do welcome that, particularly as a mother of a daughter who's an engineer. So I'm very pleased to see that kind of thing happening, and I congratulate Ashley on that. I also want to, in terms of the social justice commitment in the budget, I want to particularly welcome, as well as the house building programme, the £21 million for the Scottish Child Payment. It will be worth £10 a week for every eligible child, and I was delighted to see that the first payments will be made by Christmas this year for each child aged under 6. When the programme is fully rolled out, it is estimated that 30,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. And families will benefit also from an uplift in the Scottish Welfare Fund allocation, which increased from £3 million to £3 million to £41 million, a move that has been welcomed by a number of third sector charities in the area, including the Poverty Alliance, Menu for Change and the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. The budget includes £3.4 billion in social security expenditure for the most vulnerable in our society. But it is really tragic that alongside our own social security commitments, the SNP government has to spend at least £1.4 billion to mitigate the worst effects of Westminster benefit cuts. And that's all the more remarkable when you consider that over the last 10 years, Scotland's budget allocation from the UK Treasury has fallen by £1.5 billion, which is, Presiding Officer, an absolute disgrace.
Thank you very much, Mr Calpine. I call Graham Simpson, followed by John Mason.
Thank you. Fixing the roads, emptying the bins, music tuition, outdoor learning, parks, environmental health, planning, building control, driving growth. All things that councils deliver, all things put at risk by this government, by this budget. Councils have for too long been the poor relations of the public sector, and yet increasingly they're expected to carry out the donkey work for central government, and that has to end. Now, I've got to admit something, Presiding Officer. Kate Forbes had me fooled. I really thought she was genuinely interested in ditching Patrick Harvey's madcap growth deniers. I really thought she was genuinely interested in finding common ground with someone else. My word, she even had Murdo, Fraser and Donald Cameron reaching out to find consensus. She had Messrs Fraser and Cameron going to the trouble of coming up with a set of reasonable proposals that would protect public services. Yes, indeed.
Proposals were, in fact, actually quite reasonable. In fact, I think I recall one of them was funding COSLA's demand of £95 million, which is in the budget agreement, which I hope he will be supporting at a budget voting today.
Graham Simpson.
I'm going to come on to that money for councils. Now, I think the sticking point was avoiding the tax gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK growing. Now, we said that as a minimum, the core funding for local government needed to be increased in line with inflation, and all the additional extra commitments that have been put upon local councils, that's £497 million, funded in full, along with any new or additional commitments. And whatever spin the government puts on their settlement with the Greens, this budget will still see all councils making cuts. The extra £95 million announced yesterday for revenue funding is still way short of what is actually needed. Now, when I questioned COSLA's finance lead, Councillor Gail McGregor, at the Local Government and Communities Committee last week, she couldn't have been any clearer. She said we would need about £300 million extra just to cover inflation and the shortfall. That would enable us to stand still. And when I asked if an extra £95 million would see every council in Scotland having to make cuts, she said yes. And of course, there's nothing in this budget settlement about extra capital funding for councils, nothing. So cuts in services and increases in council tax across the board, that's what local government is facing with this sticking plaster budget. All councils will increase council tax again in a sec. This is rise on top of rise. We'll soon get to a point where we have people living in council tax poverty. We may be there already. And I'll take the Minister.
Kevin Stuart.
Thank Mr Simpson for giving way. South Lanarkshire Council, which he used to be a member of, yesterday unanimously agreed a budget. I wish the same could happen in this place. But he's wrong to say that there are no changes, because what we have seen with the deals is South Lanarkshire Council getting an extra £5.569 million in revenue funding and an extra £880,000 in capital funding because of this deal. It's a pity that the Tories wouldn't play ball in that regard.
Graham Simpson.
I hope I'll get that time back. That doesn't answer the point that
yes, I've made sure that if you have a 5-minute speech, the intervention should get another minute if it takes that.
Jolly good.
Just be happy.
Good. That does not answer the point that all councils will still have to make cuts. COSLA have said the budget results in £117 million cut to capital budgets. The capital settlement puts at risk significant projects which will promote inclusive growth across Scotland. Another of our reasonable asks was around homelessness. The draft budget makes £50 million available for the Ending Homelessness Together Fund, but as the Salvation Army pointed out last week, Scottish councils have submitted proposals for spending on homelessness for £130 million. We asked for a rather modest £10 million extra, and there's no mention about that. The point is that while I welcome the efforts being made by the government to tackle homelessness, more is required. We should all be on the same page here. It's spending to save. Now, sometimes it's best to let ordinary people have their say. People like Motherwell mum Fiona Sharkey, who I met recently. She wrote to me about the threat to music provision in North Lanarkshire. And she says this: music provision opens the world up to children and exposes them to environments and opportunities so radically different to the reality for many of growing up in North Lanarkshire. She goes on, if North Lanarkshire Council destroy this service, they not only impact all the staff who will lose their jobs, they threaten the future of children who are studying music and risk failing their exams because they find themselves without a teacher. All of this will make Scotland a poorer place to live in, culturally and economically, now and for many years to come. And lo and behold, North Lanarkshire Council has cut music provision, though they did save a pipe band. But they have cancelled Christmas. There will be no festive lights this year, folks. Now, councils are not fringe organisations. They're increasingly being asked to do more and more for less and less. The cracks are starting to show, and it can't continue. This is the year when the pain has to end.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I call John Mason, followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As always, I'm delighted to take part in the budget debate, and I'm pleased that an agreement has been reached. It's a hugely important debate as we're deciding on our income and expenditure plans for the coming year. These impact on our health services, our police, our local government, and many other sectors where our decisions impact on many people's lives. I think the first point I would make is that we do not have enough money for all we would like to do. Of course, almost all of us would want more money for a whole host of public services, and for the third sector for that matter. And no one wants to pay more taxes than we have to. A theme which we always return to in these budget debates, perhaps because the opposition parties keep forgetting it, is that we have to set a budget which balances. Of course, anyone can just demand more money. The Conservative amendment today is disappointing, not because of the two areas of extra spending they would like, they are in themselves perfectly good, but because there is a lack of realism about how the budget works. I had expected better from a party which claims to understand numbers and from Mr Simpson, who just asked for an extra £300 million. In yesterday's Justice debate, a Labour speaker said to the Cabinet Secretary, "You are responsible for the budget." Now, that is true, but opposition members are responsible for potential amendments. They are responsible for ensuring that every ask has a balancing cut. Another phrase used yesterday was that the police are underfunded, and today at FMQs, Richard Leonard used the phrase under-resourced. Now, what does the opposition mean by underfunded or under-resourced? Do they mean the police want and could use extra money? Yes, we'd all agree with that. Do they mean that there is spare money sitting around available? No, there is not that spare money. And on the subject of spare money, I'll take Joanne Lamont, yes?
Joanne Lamont. I hear what you say about the budget and reflect particularly on our own city. I wonder if you agree with your own SNP council colleagues, one of whom said that the Scottish Government the assessment was very disappointing, and another SNP councillor, Alan Casey, said that there were significant budget problems. I think Glasgow has been dealt a bad hand in terms of this budget. Do you agree, and would you support me in arguing for greater resources for our city?
John Mason.
I want more resources for Glasgow, for Aberdeen, for the NHS, for lots of things. But my point in this speech, if she's been listening so far, is that we have to live within our means. On the subject of spare money, if there's a slight underspend at the end of March, that does not mean there's a huge pot available for every need. Our budget, let's remember, is now some £40 billion, and 1% of that is £400 million. Now, £400 million is a lot of money, even for Glasgow City Council, but as a percentage of our budget, it is within the bounds of forecasting error when we understand that the OBR, for example, is often 3.5% out in its forecasting. Of course, another way of engaging the budget process is not just to take part in any realistic way at all. And the one councillor that Joanne Lamont didn't mention was the Labour councillor who walked out of the budget meeting. Now, that is not a highly responsible way of taking part in a budget process, how to come up with a budget that balances and commands support. Anyone who wants more money for health or local government or something else really has to say where that money is coming from and if that in turn means more tax or cuts elsewhere. If I can just make a couple of points on consequentials, which were mentioned several times, especially yesterday in the Justice debate. The point of this Parliament is to make our own decisions on the priorities for the people of Scotland. Yes, we have passed on health consequentials straight to health, but that should be the exception rather than the norm. For example, we want to have a more caring social security system, so if that means we need to reallocate resources from elsewhere, we should not be automatically copying spending patterns from England. Of course, borrowing can be another option. Westminster has the capacity to borrow without much limitation, and some here perhaps feel we should follow suit. But let's remember that the Westminster debt is around £1.8 to £1.9 trillion, which is something like £30,000 per head in the UK. Both Labour and the Tories have been guilty of irresponsible borrowing. This level of debt is not sustainable. Now, absolutely, we should identify with councils, NHS and others who are impacted by the tight finances we all face. And I have to say Glasgow City Council has made difficult decisions, but has done well to protect spending on teachers and education. Now, a few people have said to me that we should look at the overseas budget. And I think we should remember it is only £10 million for the International Development Fund. That is a very small part of our national budget, 1/4 of 0.1%, or to put it another way, 2.5 pence out of every £100 we spend. The reality is that in world terms, we are still a very wealthy country. We know that many of our citizens who are not well off themselves give sacrificially to charities like Mary's Meals or Tear Fund, who are working to help vulnerable people in developing countries. So I think we are reflecting the priorities of many of Scotland's people when we allocate this very small amount to overseas needs. It's worth remembering that that money would not make a big difference to the budget here, but can go a lot further in Malawi, Zambia or Rwanda. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, yes, we would all like to spend more on many things, but we have to live within our means, and I think this budget makes a very reasonable attempt to share out our resources in a fair way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Ian Gray to be followed by John Finney. Mr Finney is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Gray, please.
Thank you. The Government's budget document says that it aspires to the creation of a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish. If that was the case, then it would have to provide adequate investment in our schools, colleges and universities. For there can be no clearer or more effective investment in our future prosperity and no more direct way to maximise opportunity for future generations. And that would be true, indeed, of any government. But for this one, having declared education their top priority and closing the attainment gap a sacred duty, it is surely a given. And yet, this government's track record over 13 years is one of systematic disinvestment in education. And the budget, as presented today, simply fails to halt that trend, never mind restore that lost investment. Let's start with colleges, who do indeed receive a small real terms increase in revenue funding in the draft budget. But that fails to restore the repeated swinging cuts those colleges have seen in the past decade. Indeed, figures we have obtained from SPICE show that the FE resource budget next year will be 10% less than it was 10 years ago in real terms. And what's more, the budget provides a capital allocation next year, which is not only cut in cash terms, but is less than half the requirement identified by the sector. And as for universities, the picture is even bleaker. They have seen resource funding cut by over 11.5% over the past 5 years. And this draft budget gives them no real terms increase at all. As Professor Nolan of Universities Scotland says, the reality is that universities have no more money in real terms to spend on students and staff than they had last year. No wonder university staff salaries have been squeezed. No wonder more and more university staff are on temporary or even 0 hours contracts. No wonder they have found themselves having to be out on strike right now. And as for students, we are spending £700 less per year on their education. And the budget has no money to implement the promised improvements to student support. Presiding Officer, what kind of short-sighted government chooses to squeeze FE and to deprioritise universities so critical to our future? I guess one that is also daft enough to underinvest in schools. Schools, of course, are the biggest item in council budgets. And with today's budget, cutting council allocations by £300 million in real terms, on the back of previous cuts year on year, be in no doubt schools will suffer. They already have. Since 2013-14, local government's non-ring-fenced revenue funding has been cut by an alarming £899 million in real terms. No wonder we spend £288 less per primary pupil and £129 less per secondary pupil than we did 10 years ago. No wonder we still have 2,500 fewer teachers in our schools than we did when this government first took office. And the additional support these teachers used to have has disappeared from many of our classrooms altogether. This budget will just make these things worse. Just look at those councils who have already set their budget. We've already heard that in Glasgow, the SNP-led council has planned to close the much-loved Bleifadach Outdoor Centre, which has served the city's children since 1974. It survived. It survived decades of Tory cuts and Tory austerity, but it couldn't survive the SNP at Holyrood and in Glasgow city chambers. And in Edinburgh too, the budget passed last week cuts £1.6 million from devolved school budgets. So much for empowering schools. Yesterday, Mr Swinney made a speech in Westerhales Education Centre.
The member's winding up.
He failed to mention that school's devolved budget has been slashed by over £20,000. Presiding Officer, this budget does little for colleges, it does nothing for universities, and it does yet more damage to our schools. It fails to invest in our future prosperity, it fails to invest in excellence in our education system, but worst of all, Mr Swinney, worst of all, it fails to invest in the future opportunities of our children and grandchildren. It's not good enough.
I now call John Finney, then we move to closing speeches. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I should declare my Saltire card and along with my senior rail card here, and I'm delighted that the Scottish Greens have secured free bus travel for under-19s as part of this budget deal. This is a transformational policy that will benefit over 1 million young people across Scotland and their families. It will tackle poverty and isolation. It will make families better off, and we heard the example earlier from Patrick Harvey. It will give young people the mobility and freedom they need to access education and employment opportunities, not to mention the social benefits this will bring them. It will help tackle the climate emergency. It will reduce congestion and toxic air pollution by getting more people on buses. It will give people an affordable alternative to private cars. And we forget at our peril the number of people who don't have access to a motor vehicle. And helping rebuild a culture of using public transport after decades of decline. It will bolster bus services across the country, putting tens of millions of pounds into the industry, getting more passengers on seats that are otherwise empty, not to mention more fare-paying passengers, adults, as a result of making family travel more affordable. I've only 3 minutes, I'm afraid, Mr Green. The benefits of making buses free to under-18s are therefore profound for rural areas too. Rural bus users often face much higher fares than urban users, and this is closing down opportunities for young people in rural communities and causing social isolation. As one person said in a survey run by Scottish Rural Action, and I quote here, "I had a part-time job half an hour away. The cost of the bus fare was the equivalent to 2 hours' pay from a 4 or 5 hour shift, which became untenable." Individuals like this young person will immediately be helped by what we have announced today, but so will those who do not currently have access to a bus route, because we are at a turning point for the bus industry. Bus use has been in long-term decline as public transport has been neglected by successive Scottish governments who focus support and money on road building. So last year, the Greens secured powers in the Transport Act to allow councils to run their own bus services, and will now see new life breathed into the industry as a result of the Greens working with others, including Mr Smith, getting their transformational policy of free buses for all people introduced to the budget. It's no wonder the announcement has been welcomed by so many diverse individuals and groups across Scotland, from Friends of the Earth Scotland to the Poverty Alliance and the Children and Young People's Commissioners. And we're on a journey to transform habits, and we've seen that can happen in East Lothian. I'm not surprised that the Tories will not back this policy today. Their only priority throughout this process has been cuts for the wealthy. But I'm shocked and disappointed that Labour and Liberal Democrats are lining up behind the Tories yet again. A vote for the budget today is a vote to make bus travel free for over 1 million young people across Scotland. And I urge everyone in this chamber to put their political squabbling aside and to get behind this transformational policy to get Scotland moving, to address poverty and to tackle the climate emergency.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I call on Rhoda Grant to close for Labour. 6 minutes, please, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour entered into talks to try and improve the budget. After 13 years of mismanagement, we and the communities we serve are in desperate need of investment. Investment in our public services, schools, community care and an end to potholes. But yet again, this year, the SNP and their little helpers, the Greens, sold our communities short. Parties that are more interested in flags than people, more interested in division than mending and growing our communities. We can't support them in this. While we welcome more money for local government, this deal does not stop local government cuts. We see continuing bed blocking. We will see young people failed as education standards fall, and with more additional support needs, children being left behind. This is a budget of continued austerity at the hands of the SNP and Greens. We wanted to see free... I'll take one intervention.
Alec Neil.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. If we give even more money to local authorities, and I wouldn't be against that in principle, but where is it going to be funded from? What would you cut in order to give them that money?
Rhoda Grant.
there is an assumption that cuts are made. One, I would delve behind the big sofa again and find some more money. But I would also look at the reserves. I would also look at a social responsibility levy. And I'd also look at the tax rates for higher earners. Things, levers at the control of this government that they refuse to use. Presiding Officer, we wanted free bus travel for young people under 25. So even if this deal delivers, 400,000 young people are missing out. But what the Greens settled for is to look at what might be provided for under 18s. They didn't agree free bus travel for under 18s. They only agreed investigation of whether that would happen. And for a fraction of that price, they could have delivered tomorrow free bus travel for under 16s, but they settled for talks about talks.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Talking about prices, I respect the fact that Labour were looking for free bus travel for under 25s. Can the member tell the Chamber what they had costed their proposals for under 25s at?
Yes, Grant. And indeed it was, I shared those costings with the Minister, and she shared her costings with me, and her costings didn't actually appear to be based on any form of our costings through SPICE were based on the use of the Young Scot card, around £26 million to deliver our policy. They provided no costings whatsoever, but an assumption that it would cost more than delivering free bus travel for older people. Now, I don't believe this is going to happen. I hope very much that they will deliver. But just look back to past budgets. What they said about past budget SOPs. They said to the Greens last year that they would look at scrapping council tax. This week I spent an hour in a meeting that talked about amending council tax, talked about varying the bands, and it's going nowhere. We are left with a regressive council tax. Take the SOP in the budget about fair ferry funding for the Northern Isles. Another thing that has made no progress at all, with funding diminishing rather than finding a sustainable future for our ferries in the Northern Isles. Presiding Officer, bus usage is falling. 8 million journeys per year have fallen. This is a fudge for young people. We need to ensure that bus travel goes up. Giving free bus travel to the under 25s not only would have improved bus services for them, it would have improved bus services for all of us and provided life-changing habits for young people where they would use bus services into adulthood. Ian Gray just talked about higher and further education and indeed schools. He listed the cuts to their budgets and told us about 2,500 fewer teachers on their watch. ASN support has all but disappeared, and my colleague Jackie Bailey, his members' debate this week, talked about how ASN children are being failed at school, and many indeed are not being educated at all. We wanted a budget that delivered a just transition, not just a salt and crumbs towards the net zero target. We wanted a budget where the whole 50 billion is tested against a just transition, to be tested against a national performance framework. Presiding Officer, there will be consequentials, hopefully from the UK Government, and I will reiterate my call to the Finance Minister again, that negotiations take place over those consequentials, that she brings them to the Parliament so we can look at how that can be best spent to improve the future of all our citizens. It could have been so different. The budget could have halted cuts. However, our communities will continue to see their public services disappear. Council's discretionary spending has fallen near 900 million since 2013, and that is even after the additional 95 million. We want investment in our public services, and we would have backed a budget that had stopped cuts, but this budget heaps yet more misery on our communities, and therefore we cannot back it.
Thank you very much. I call on Murdo Fraser to close the Conservatives. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a lively debate. If the award for the most statesmanlike speech goes to my good friend Bruce Crawford, then the award for the most amusing so far goes to Alec Neil. although he was, of course, totally wrong about everything he said. Nevertheless, he entertained us. Now, Presiding Officer, in these troubled times, it's always good to have certainties in life we can rely upon. In Scotland, we can always rely on the weather in February being miserable. We can always be confident our football team will perform dreadfully against whichever low-ranked opponent they are playing this week. And we guarantee that, despite all their posturing and bluster, the Scottish Greens will always end up voting for the SNP budget. And so it's turned out once again this week with the Greens lining up with their fellow nationalists. But it does look like this year they have sold themselves very cheap. It's only a few weeks ago the Greens were setting out their red lines for this budget, demanding that road building projects be cancelled, that the A9 dualling be stopped, the A96 dualling be stopped. They were calling for a 4-day working week to be introduced. None of these things have been delivered, and thank goodness for that, Presiding Officer. Instead, what is now being trumpeted by the Greens is the introduction of a free bus travel for those aged 19 and under. And there were all these press releases yesterday from the Green Party and social media comment from Green MSPs claiming their victory in delivering this groundbreaking policy to tackle climate change. But, Presiding Officer, when we look at what has actually been agreed, it falls far short of a firm commitment. It is actually, and I'm quoting directly from the Finance Secretary's written answer yesterday, £15 million to support preparations to introduce new concessionary free bus travel for young people aged 18 and under, with the aim, if possible, to begin in January 2021. So it's just preparations. It's just a possibility, as the Finance Secretary confirmed earlier. And it's just £15 million against an annual estimated cost of £80 million. Presiding Officer, Mr Harvey will now explain how this is a firm commitment.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I'll be delighted if we're going into the next election saying that the only way to have an easily delivered policy put into practice is to put Greens into government. But I don't think the Scottish Government is going to give us the opportunity, because this is very clearly deliverable. The only thing that would make the young Greens happier is if Mr Fraser would tell us that the young Conservatives think this is such a bad idea that they'll never get on the bus to have to share it with them.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I don't think we're any the wiser, Presiding Officer, after that intervention as to whether this policy has been delivered or not. But it's not just on that policy, Presiding Officer. The Greens have been sold short. Now, yesterday, they were claiming that the proposed flyover at the Sheriff Hall roundabout should be revisited, a vital infrastructure project connecting Edinburgh to Midlothian and to the borders. But because this project has been delivered as part of the Edinburgh City deal, and the change to that policy will require the agreement of the UK Government and local authority partners, that change will be up to them. That's what the Finance Secretary confirmed yesterday in a TV interview. So the Greens have been sold short once again. So, Presiding Officer, I have to congratulate Kate Forbes on what she has achieved so far as Finance Secretary. She's only been in the job for 9 days, but already she has stitched up Patrick Harvey far more successfully than anything our predecessor achieved in more than 3 years in the role. Presiding Officer, overall, this budget is a disappointment and could have been so much better. It was based upon a 3.7% uplift in real terms in the total resource spending available, thanks to the Boris bonus due to increased Westminster spending. Now, against that, as Bruce Crawford reminded us, we had, of course, to offset the negative reconciliation of more than £200 million from poorer income tax receipts than forecast from 3 years ago, and also the lower income tax forecast relative to the rest of the UK, having a downwards effect on the amount of money available to the Scottish Government to spend. And it all demonstrates, once again, if we could grow the Scottish economy, if we could grow it at just the same rate as the UK average, we'd have many hundreds of millions of pounds more to spend on public services without having to increase taxes any further. Now, Alec Neil made a contribution on the fiscal framework. He seems to have forgotten in that contribution the person who negotiated the fiscal framework was Mr Swinney on behalf of the Scottish Government. So if he has a problem with what's in the fiscal framework, he needs to take it up with his colleague on the front bench. Now, despite all the extra money available and despite the fiscal transfer, from the rest of the United Kingdom of £10.7 million, this is a budget that still delivers cuts. An extra £95 million in revenue for local government is welcome, but nothing extra is delivered for capital. That means real terms cut of £117 million in capital for local authorities across Scotland. It will mean that projects currently being planned, local roads and infrastructure, new school builds and refurbishments, leisure and recreation centre investments will all now have to be rethought because this SNP government, backed up by the Greens, are cutting the budgets of local authorities. And right across Scotland today, local authorities are having to set budgets and make cuts. Donald Cameron reminded us, cuts in school crossing patrollers, cuts in teacher numbers, cuts in classroom assistants, cuts to music tuition, cuts to opening hours of libraries and leisure facilities, cuts to the opening hours of local recycling centres from a budget supposedly focused on climate change. That is what being delivered right across Scotland, thanks to the SNP and to the Greens working together. And at the same time, many places facing council tax rises of nearly 5% this year, as Graham Simpson reminded us. In effect, the budgets of local councils across Scotland are being raided to fund the pet project of both the SNP and the Greens. And if we do ever see free bus travel for the under-19s, these buses will be travelling on heavily potholed roads because the Greens have stolen the money out of local government to fund the bus travel scheme. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives engaged constructively with the draft budget, and I'd like to thank the Finance Secretary for her constructive engagement. But we cannot support this budget today. Despite the extra resources available to the Scottish Government, it falls short of what Scotland requires. It will deliver more cuts, it doesn't tackle the drugs crisis, and for all the noise they are making, the Greens have sold themselves short once again. This is a budget which Parliament should reject.
Thank you very much. Now calling Kate Forbes, opposed to the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary till 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, this budget delivers certainty, stability and stimulus for Scotland. It protects our public services and it delivers on the budget's priority themes of tackling climate change, reducing child poverty, supporting inclusive growth and, in the roundest sense, improving the well-being of people in Scotland. And at a time of turmoil and uncertainty as a result of the UK Government's actions, it's essential that we lead the way as a Parliament for the people of Scotland. Now, I want to reflect on some comments from colleagues, and I want to start with the wider context, because the Conservatives opened their remarks by saying, and I quote, "There is no austerity." Only a Conservative could look at the last 10 years during which, under a Tory government, Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation has been cut by 2.8% or £840 million between 2010 and 2021. Tories now talk about the windfall that they're kindly and benignly bestowing upon us, but only the Tories could call a slight increase that does not reverse the decade of cuts as a bonus, whether it's Boris's or anybody else's. Now, of course, if the Tories were so proud of this year's block grant, then why wait so late? Why wait, forcing us to do our own budget ahead of the UK Government, introducing even more uncertainty? So for Conservatives to say that there is no austerity, it's quite remarkable. But despite the significant investment we've made through this budget, the Tories have also confirmed that they won't support the budget because of tax. They'll vote against increased funding for local government, for the police and for health because of tax divergence. Now, the intriguing thing in all of that is that any divergence would, of course, be the result of the UK Government's decisions, the UK Government cutting tax rates. In 2018, the then-Chancellor promised to freeze the higher rate threshold in 2020-21. So if there is to be any divergence, it will only be because the UK Government has A, broken its promise, and B, once again prioritised tax cuts at the expense of other services. Now, I will.
Murdo, Fraser.
I'm grateful to the Finance Secretary for giving away. Perhaps she would just confirm to the Chamber that if the Scottish Government were to match any changes in UK income tax rates under the fiscal framework negotiated by Mr Swinney, there would be no additional cost to the Scottish Government.
I am not prepared to outsource our decisions on tax to the UK Government and to wait for the Tories to hurry up and get their budget done whilst we bake in anticipated consequentials rather than the agreed consequentials, which will only come on the 11th of March, the very date by which our precious public services and local government has to set council tax. Now, Jamie Green talked about our teachers. What he forgot to say is that the starting salary for a fully qualified teacher in Scotland is significantly higher than elsewhere in the UK. And this budget commits the latest funding to increase teachers' pay. After income tax and pay policy choices for 2020-21 are passed this evening and ultimately at stage 3, a teacher at the top of the main scale will be around £950 better off next year than this year. Incidentally, a staff nurse will be around £700 better off. That's a band 5 at the top of the pay scale. And a senior nurse will be around £890 better off. That's a band 6. That is what this budget delivers. Now, Labour raised concerns about local authorities, and that's why in the agreement that we reached yesterday, we have met COSLA's ask of £95 million. Now, capital has also been mentioned, and in terms of capital, local authorities will also be able to access the £1 billion Schools for the Future programme to invest in the school estate. They'll be able to access over £800 million to invest in affordable homes, and there is also £201 million for city, region and growth deals.
Rhoda Grant.
For the future funding, just revenue funding, where councils borrow and the government gives them some money towards that borrowing cost, rather than an investment by the Scottish Government in their schools?
Of course, it's an investment in by the Scottish Government in our schools estate, building on the very successful Schools for the Future programme, which saw the second highest amount going to our own local authority area of the Highland Council. The budget also includes the new £200 million for the Green Growth Accelerator to help and support local authorities invest in low-carbon infrastructure. And on revenue, the additional revenue funding of £594 million taken together with potential council tax income of up to £135 million means that councils have the potential to access an additional £724 million next year in resource. Presiding Officer, I think the reason why we've heard the relatively predictable accusations and counter-accusations this afternoon is because this is a good budget. And yesterday's agreement is good for the communities and the businesses of this country. Now, Bruce Crawford, on behalf of the Finance Committee, identified some of the risks and the challenges that the budget faces as part of the fiscal framework. Those are recognisable, and we need to take steps to meet those challenges. I can tell the Parliament that I spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury earlier today to highlight some of the risks of the volatility that comes with the fiscal framework, and we need to work together and collaboratively to ensure that we manage those risks and that volatility. But despite that, despite the uncertainty, despite the unknown consequentials that will come to us on the 11th of March, we have before us this evening a budget. It is the best available budget for Scotland. It delivers for local authorities, it delivers for the wider public sector, and it delivers for the people of Scotland. It will continue to deliver the key priorities for the people of Scotland, and I would urge all members of the Chamber to support this budget to ensure that we benefit the people of Scotland and we give people who need the certainty at a time like this, the certainty that they need, and ensure that we vote for it at 5 o'clock today. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That concludes our debate on Stage 1 debate on the budget. However, I'm just going to give members an extra minute, just in case there are, I'm not saying this vote is hanging by a knife edge, but I want to allow everybody to have a chance to come to the Chamber. So we're just going to wait for another 50 seconds to 5 o'clock. Chamber looks great. Thank you. No member has actually come in the doors, but better safe than sorry. So we turn to decision time. There are two questions today. The first question is that Amendment 21013.1 in the name of Donald Cameron on the Budget Scotland No. 4 bill at Stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on Mr Cameron's amendment. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 21013.1 in the name of Donald Cameron is yes 29, no 90. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. So the final question is that motion 21013 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Budget Scotland bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on motion 21013 in the name of Kate Forbes is yes 65, no 54. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. That concludes decision time. I close this meeting.
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.